Antoinette, who we've just been hearing about, trying to get out of France, and spoiler alert, they fail. And that is the cliffhanger on which we will leave it.
Yeah.
Because, of course, everybody knows what will then happen to the king and queen.
Yes.
And I think Marie Antoinette is a kind of wonderful focus for looking at some of the causes, because she's very, very celebrated, one of the instantly kind of recognisable figures.
She must be one of the 2 or 3 most well-known people in all French history, I would have said.
Yes, and at the time, she is seen by enthusiasts for the revolution as the absolute embodiment of everything. She is the kind of the incarnation of Ancien Regime, arrogance, of aristocratic splendour, and of a kind of quality of vampirism that has leached the French people of what should be rightfully theirs.
Yeah.
And in her lifetime, before and then particularly after the revolution, she is the object of absolutely kind of obsessive hatred, and it's also a kind of prurient hatred. You know, because it is tied up with kind of fantasies about what she's been getting up to. And I guess that runs through to the present day, because the one phrase that everyone would associate with the Let Me Cake is still repeated, isn't it? Despite the fact that she never said.
I know. And the original phrase is qui mange la brioche. So let me brioche has slightly different connotations, doesn't it?
Yeah, because I always kind of imagine a big gatto, kind of strawberries on the top. Or
but
something.
she never said it anyway, so there's no point in dissecting it, I guess, to some degree, other than the fact that people think she said it is indicative of this idea of her and Louis, who's supposedly kind of both, who's her puppet, then living this life of unbelievable depravity and licentiousness and arrogance and not caring.
Yeah.
All of which, well, not all of which is completely wrong, but there are definitely huge problems with that.
Nuances there. But again, against that, against the image of Marie Antoinette as a kind of depraved vampire, there's also been, right from the beginning, for conservatives, a sense that she is the archetype of the victims of the revolution. Her fate exemplifies what critics of the revolution see as its destructiveness, as its kind of bloodlust. So the revolution itself is cast as a vampire. And in England, the person who classically first articulates that is the Irish politician, who November 1790 wrote Reflections of the Revolution in France. And in that, famously recalls seeing Marie Antoinette 16 or 17 years before, called glittering like the morning star, full of life and splendour and joy. And he famously used high thoughts, 10,000 swords as to leap from their scabbards to avenge the look that threatened with himself. That the age of chivalry is gone, that of simplicity, economists and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever.
I would say his is among biographers and among people who study the revolution, it's his take actually that is more enduring than the Let Them Eat Cake, she's a vampire school of thought, isn't it? Because actually now, I would say most writers are filled with horror. Look at what happened to this young girl who arrived in France was determined to dictate for the mob.
Well, Chantal Thomas, who you her book is about the vituperation that is kind of lashed on Marie Antoinette, and she has a section that talks about how biographers really might debate about whether these were true or not. And she said, none of these stories about the incest and the vampirism are true. They're obviously not true. And she says that most recent biographies have been written, and to quote her, with sympathy, if not with love. And I would say that's probably true of her as well, because she wrote a novel that then got turned into a film called Farewell My Queen in English that featured Diane Kruger, so Helen of Troy in Troy, as Marie Antoinette. And that's a French film. But of course, Marie Antoinette has also been a kind of an American pin-up. So a film that was massively popular with my daughters when they were growing up, came out in 2006, is Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette, in which she's kind of cast as, very much a contemporary heroine. She's surrounded by her squad.
Yeah.
She's got Converse trainers in the cabinet. She rushes around Versailles to new wave bands. And what was interesting about that, I was kind of reading up about the reception of it in France, because it was premiered at Cannes, and there it was greeted with boos and then with cheers, so kind of answering boos and cheers by the French journalists who'd been watching it, which I guess kind of sums up a massive division in France itself.
Because Marie Antoinette
about her.
stands for the revolution to some degree. Because what you think of Marie Antoinette, you ask a French, an educated Frenchman or Frenchwoman what they think of Marie Antoinette, and their answer will tell you what they think of the revolution, probably.
All right. What I need to do is I need to play
where they stand politically, even today in the 21st century. Don't you think?
Avoid damage.
Yeah, I do, and I think to a degree that may be true as well in the broader world, perhaps. But I mean, it's much more focused in France, obviously. And I think that sense of ambivalence, is Marie Antoinette a monster, or is she a victim? Is she someone to be detested and loathed, or is she someone to be pitied and admired?
As I get better at avoiding damage,
that's there even before the revolution. So, what is the way that she is viewed by the French public is a kind of mixture of loathing and desire.
Because she's not always hated. That's an important point to make.
She's not, and there are certain, she's very popular with certain segments of society, and I think that she's cast either as a kind of emblem of royal grace, because she's, as we will see, in a way, she's a very, very modern figure.
Yeah, completely.
She kind of basically, I think, invents the French ideal of fashion. She's way ahead of the game, but to other people, this makes her kind of the embodiment of frivolity or decadence.
Yeah.
She's a very proactive queen. Queens in France generally are not expected to play a proactive role in court life and national life, still less national life. Marie Antoinette comes to do that. And she's a kind of emblem of all the paradoxes that we talk about in the revolution. But the fact that she's a figure of fantasy is really crucial, because not just her, but the revolution itself is about the creation of stories, the projection of stories and narratives onto facts of the economy, agriculture, the crowds, court, everything. It's how you structure the story that basically determines the revolution. Do you think that's...
Absolutely, totally agree. I mean, historians like Simon Sharma and Robert Darnton have written brilliant books about how the French Revolution is it's a sort of hall of mirrors, or a hall of narratives, I suppose.
Very quickly.
Yeah.
Versailles.
For Versailles. So let's start not at Versailles, but with Marie Antoinette herself. So she's born Tom in 1755. The single most important thing about her is that she is not French. She is Austrian. She is. We love the Habsburgs. There'll ever be a historical podcast in the history of mankind that is so keen on the Habsburgs as the rest is history. We've had Edward Habsburg, the Habsburgs, we've had Franz Ferdinand, great friend of the rest is history, and now another Habsburg.
Yes, although she's born Maria Antonia. And I think that it's fair to say that her identity as an Austrian and as a Habsburg is kind of fundamental both to how her admirers see her and how her detractors see her. So, to her admirers, she is an embodiment of New Age peace between what traditionally has been the great rivals of the European continent.
Yeah.
So going right the way back to the 16th century, Charles V and Oswald I, these are the people who are kind of tearing Europe up while Luther is busy getting on with his stuff. And France and the Habsburg Empire have been the great geopolitical rivals on the continent of Europe. But this has changed over the course of the 18th century due to the emergence of two new great powers.
Yeah.
One of those is Britain, very happy to say. So in the 7 Years' War, Britain is taking on France and winning as a kind of global power. But on the continent, it's the emergence of Prussia.
Yes.
And Prussia is hungry for a lot of Austrian traditional territories. And under its great king Frederick Frederick II, it annexes a province called Silesia, doesn't it? Which is basically now it's a chunk of Poland.
Yeah.
And the Habsburgs are terribly upset about this. And basically, they kind of enter into an alliance with France so that they can get Silesia back. And France enters into an alliance with Austria so that she can have a counterweight to Britain.
So the diplomatic revolution, historians call this, because it's such a seismic moment in European history.
Yeah, so the 7 Years' War breaks out in 1756 with Britain and Prussia against Austria and France. And the following year, a very heavyweight figure in French politics, the Duc de Choiseul, arrives in Vienna as the French ambassador. And the rulers who greet him, they're a couple, aren't they? So there's the emperor is Francis I, but the person who's really kind of cracking the whip is his wife, the Empress Maria Theresa. Yeah. And she is a very, very proficient politician, indeed one might say stateswoman. But she's also very, very fertile. And the Habsburgs have always, I mean, it's been their boast, isn't it, that some empires get their way by fighting, we do it by marrying off our children. Yep. And Maria Antonia is their 11th daughter, and as it will turn out, their last daughter. And the reason that the Duc de Choiseul is interested in her is that she is 1 year younger than the grandson of Louis XV, the French king, also inevitably called Louis. And his very fertile mind is thinking, well, we could maybe marry them off.
A brilliant way to make the alliance and to ensure that the alliance endures.
Yes. And so in due course, Choiseul goes back from Vienna, he goes back to Paris, and he becomes the foreign minister. Basically the kind of almost the prime minister for Louis XV. And he's kind of pushing this idea. He's saying, we should really try and cement this alliance. And it comes into further focus in 1765 when Louis XV's son, and therefore the father of this Louis, who is being lined up to marry Maria Antonia, he dies. And so the grandson of Louis XV is now the Dauphin, the kind of French equivalent of the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne.
He's 11. He's 11, and Maria Antonia is then, is 10? 10, yeah.
On the 4th of April 1770, it's all agreed. The marriage contract is signed. There's a kind of weird thing where they do a proxy marriage in Vienna. So the new emperor, Maria Theresa's son, Joseph, he stands in as for the Dauphin. And then 2 days later, Maria Antonia is put into a carriage along with 56 other carriages, and they set off from Vienna to go to France. And people who are enthusiasts for this alliance think this is brilliant. Absolutely wonderful.
But of course in France there are lots of people who are not enthusiasts because, as you said, these are ancestral enemies. They have of course come together under the pressure of Russian Britain. But they're culturally imaginative. The idea of Austria to most French people puts us in this basically this horrendous place. Our enemies. The Austrians can't be trusted. And that baggage she's never shown in the rest of her life.
So right the way through her career, and kind of to an escalating degree, she was always referred to as l'Autrichienne, so the Austrian, but with the emphasis on chien, that's bitch in France. So it's kind of the Austrian bitch. So she's always been portrayed either as an ostrich or as a dog, or both. And the weird thing is, this isn't actually remotely fair, because her father is Joseph's friend. So Francis I, Duke of Lorraine, he is of French royal descent. And there's a case for saying that Marie Antoinette is actually one of the most French queens that the royal dynasty have ever had. Because normally they're marrying foreign queens who have no French connections at all. But what's interesting is that her father basically gets written out of the story, and she is portrayed in her father's solely her. Maria Theresa is seen as this terrifying virago who is out to destroy France. And so Marie Antoinette is cast as a kind of Trojan horse who's been sent into the very stronghold of French power to destroy it from inside.
Simon Charles.
Excuse me.
And Maria Antonia, who becomes, she really does become Marie Antoinette. So actually French has been her first language. She speaks it initially with a German accent, but that very language she very rapidly loses that. And in preparation for her life at the French court, and a French teacher called Abbé de Vermont, who turns up and is appalled to discover that Marie Antoinette has basically and throughout her life she's incredible.
Yeah. Not really. Although she is interested in kind of the cultural temperature, isn't she? As we will see. She's very into kind of.
But I think she kind of absorbs it. I mean, it's said of her that no one has ever seen her finish a book. And I think that is kind of widely believed. And he complains of a quality that will be repeatedly applied to her,
Okay.
which is
Not much of a hesitant.
and the fact that she's not a hating person, I think it would be fair to say. But he also acknowledges that she has great charm, she has great poise. She is also, she's not conventionally pretty, because she has the kind of, the classic troubadour of a habit.
Yeah.
But she has, the Abbé says, a perfect porcelain complexion. She has brilliant blue eyes, she has a very sweet, oval face. So basically, she will be.
Yeah, well, that's the reports. Robert Johnson's book, Revolutionary Temper, says that when the pamphleteers, newspapers, in France, they all said she's actually very nice looking. She's blonde hair, beautiful complexion. Everyone is pleased. She looks like a woman.
She does, and as we will see, she becomes a great icon of beauty and fashion and style. And there's a kind of symbolic moment where she ceases to be Austrian and becomes French, which is she's travelling up from Vienna with her, in her 57 carriages, and on the 7th of May, 1770, they reach the Rhine, and there's an island in the middle of it, and this wooden pavilion has been built that looks like a kind of a perfectly tiny chateau, and it has 5 rooms inside it. And there's kind of 2 on the Austrian side, 2 on the French side, and there's a room in the middle. And Marie Antoinette goes into the Austrian rooms. She's divested of her clothes down to her kind of underwear. She's then put into a French ceremonial dress. She's led into the central drawing room. The door leading into the French rooms is opened. She looks back. The Austrian doors have been shut. All the Austrian servants have vanished. And Marie Antoinette is handed over to this terrifying woman who is the maîtresse d'étiquette, the woman who is going to instruct her in the ritual of the court, called the Comtesse de Noailles.
What was that noise?
Comtesse de Noailles.
Yeah, it's just too many vowels. There's basically 4 vowels in there.
It's a Scrabble.
It is.
Scrabble
Yeah.
heaven. And Marie Antoinette bursts into tears inside this terrifying woman, flings herself into the Comtesse's arms. The Comtesse, massively embarrassed, very stiff, shrugs her off, performs a low curtsy. Marie Antoinette apologises and says, "Pardon me, these are the family and the fatherland I'm leaving. For the future, I shall not forget that I am French." And the Comtesse de Noailles says, "Yeah, you better not. I'm here to whip you into shape." So off they go.
And Tom, just one thing.
Yeah.
She is 14 years old. She's not yet 15. So, I mean, this is imagine what an unbelievably terrifying moment this must be for her.
And what makes it even worse, she has an adorable little dog who she has to leave behind. But we'll come to that later. It's a really part of the story. Anyway, on they rattle, and it takes them a week to with the Dauphin. Outside the forest at the end. The Dauphin and the Dauphin as married. Are introduced. 3 days later, they are married, and she is now the Queen of France.
Just on the marriage.
Run! What are you doing?
Very dark. If anyone knows about Russian history, they'll spot the resemblance. Nicholas II Alexandria, when they were crowned, there was a massive stampede afterwards. Hundreds of people were killed. Well, after the marriage of the Dauphin, there was another stampede. It was a fireworks as well. Perhaps 150 people were killed in a crush. And so after that, whenever
Just a firework drop on
right, exactly. There were 2 rival fireworks designers. A man called Monsieur Torre and a guy called Ruggieri. Ruggieri was the second to start doing the other day. It's an incredible elaborate fireworks display. It goes wrong. A firework falls into this temple of Hymen. And in the crush, 150 people killed them. So whenever people remember, they look back later on, they say, doomed from the start. What about Odin? Should never have got involved with this Austrian. The fireworks were a warning.
And there's kind of great evidence, isn't there, kind of the arms of France and the arms of the Habsburgs.
Yeah.
Kind of intertwined. And the fact that it has generated this disaster, as you say, is seen as an omen. And I think that reflects the fact that the French don't really hate the Austrians, but kind of look down on them. Because Austria relative to France has been declining since the 16th century. And France now is, with the exception of Russia, it's by far the largest kind of European realm. So it's been in the 18th century, it's been described as the China of Europe. It has by far the largest population,
28 million, twice as big as Britain. So,
and Britain even with Ireland. And it has kind of geopolitical power. It has population, as you say, and it has massive cultural prestige. And of course, the great symbol of this cultural prestige is the place where Anne has gone and where she will spend much of her life, which is the enormous palace of Versailles. It's where they're married. This enormous palace, kind of 700 rooms, 2,000 windows. The roofs cover 100 hectares. I mean, on an enormous scale. And it's basically the physical embodiment of the style of government that the French monarchy represents, which is a kind of monarchical absolutism.
Yeah.
I mean, the French monarchy had always been powerful, but since the 16th and then through the 17th and definitely into the 18th century, it's become more and more, it's monopolised power more and more. And the figure who represents that is the great-grandfather of Louis XV and predecessor, Louis XIV, who had basically annihilated the nobility as an independent political class. He had required them to come to Versailles, and they are nearly planets orbiting the sun.
Yeah, Sun King.
The Sun King. And so Versailles sets fashion, manners, dress, everything for the whole of Europe.
What is going
so
on?
The great rival of Louis XIV, the Duke of Marlborough, when he celebrates his victories over the Louis XIV by building a kind of ersatz Versailles.
Yeah, Blenheim Palace.
Blenheim Palace. For Marie Antoinette, and indeed pretty much for everybody, I mean, it's a very oppressive place, isn't it?
Oh, it's awful, because the court is... So she's grown up in the Habsburg court, which is much more informal and is becoming more informal during her childhood. But the French court is governed by... I mean, it's partly because it's governed by these very, very strict ceremonial hierarchical rules, but also it is a kind of snake pit of politics, isn't it, with people jostling for power the whole time.
Yes, and one of the problems for Marie Antoinette is that her patron, the Duc de Choiseul, falls from power only a few months after her marriage. And he'd been her sponsor, her protector, and that means that she's just a very young girl, teenager, and she's surrounded by people who hate her and hate Austria. So the aunts of the Dauphin, so Louis XV's daughters, they hate Austria. Also, the Dauphin has younger brothers, and one in particular, Comte Pons, who calls vastly, I use the word vastly, surprisingly, will become a man of colossal size. But at this point, he's still very young. He's just a teenager himself, but he's assuming the fact that he's not king. So he's a potential snake.
A younger brother who turns out to be a snake. Who could ever... That would never happen in monarchical history again, would it?
Yeah. There are certain parallels to contemporary royals that we'll be teasing out over the course of the series, I think. Poor Marie Antoinette feels completely cut off, and she complains that all her correspondence is being looked at, that nowhere she got anything safe. And essentially this is the kind of treatment that all foreign kings at Versailles are put through. They are kind of there as hostages, as much as anything else. And they're not expected to have a good time. They're not expected to enjoy themselves. But Marie Antoinette she's strong enough, and right from the beginning it's clear that she's a much stronger character than her husband. And it's clear that she is, when she gets, when she becomes queen, she is going to be back against this kind of formality. So there's a kind of classic moment where, for some reason, she's riding on the donkey. It's the kind of thing, I guess, that a teenage girl might be doing. But the Comtesse de really disapproves of. So she falls off the donkey and she kind of makes this big quip that she'd better send to the contest and find out what the etiquette is for a Dauphine falling off the donkey. And you can see there that this is an attitude that is going to rub up against a lot that has made Versailles tick.
Yeah.
However, having said that, she's resentful of the kind of formality and the stiffness of it all. There is also the fact that Versailles, particularly under Louis the 15th, is a kind of it's a showcase for unsettling displays of royal dignities. Because Louis XV, although personally quite a kind of modest and shy person, I mean he's a bit of a dirty old man.
A bit. Tom, he only ever, I mean, from morning till night, he only ever thinks about one thing. Is it not true that the first thing he said when he was told about Marie Antoinette's existence, you know, when he was...
No, it's when she's arrived.
Oh, right, when she's
The French
arrived.
had, the first thing he says is, does she have large breasts?
I mean, that's
That
bad.
is disappointing.
Yeah.
She doesn't.
From your father-in-law, you don't want to...
No, and particularly because he he's been a great man for mistresses, so he had very celebrated mistresses, Madame Pompadour, but she's gone, and the new mistress, Comtesse de Barry, who's been elevated to that title, she's a kind of former courtesan, and she has it's almost a kind of semi-formal title, the maîtresse en titre. But Marie Antoinette is taught by this. You know, she's been raised about Catholic. There's nothing like this in Vienna. And so she defies court protocol by refusing to obedience to the Comtesse de Barry. And Marie Therese, her mother, is furious about this. She's trying to get France to back her in a kind of dispute over a chunk of Poland.
Yeah.
And she said, look, you've got to talk to Madame about it. You know, I need you to do this. So, Marie Antoinette does take it, and she says to Madame de Barry, there are many on her side today. And there's great cheering.
Hurrah! What a... Yeah. Finally. The
But
dam
that's
is
it.
broken.
Yeah, she never says anything else.
Okay.
But fortunately for Marie Antoinette, neither Madame de Barry nor Louis XV are loyal to the world, because on the 27th of April, 1774, Louis XV falls ill, and gossip will say he falls ill in an entirely predictable way, because Madame de Barry has supposedly sourced a young peasant girl for him, and the valet has brought this peasant girl in, and the peasant girl turns out to have had smallpox, and so his whole face ends up a succulent mass of
Just
pustules.
that-
a bronze mask enlarged by the crust.
So that thing that you said there,
Okay, that's different.
that's really, really important. Because this is an age where the court is kind of connected to a lot from Paris and therefore to the rest of France. And so most people learn about the king through rumour and gossip. And this is an age when there are pamphlets, people are swapping ballots, it's a very literate, very news-friendly society in a way that has not really existed before.
And Dominic, what is more is that you say that Versailles is publicity, it kind of is in one way, but in another way it isn't, because all the different factions in Versailles are fighting for themselves. So all the kind of the scandalous stories that are told about the Queen and indeed of course about Marie Antoinette, these are not coming from disgruntled Republicans. They're coming from power players at the very heart of the court,
Yes.
often the royal family itself.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the wellspring of all the gossip and slander that will overwhelm Marie Antoinette in the period of the Revolution has been established by Versailles itself. Anyway, so whether Louis XV is dying because he's been brought, a peasant girl by his mistress or not is up for grabs. But what is clear is on the 10th of May 1774 he dies. The news is brought to the Dauphin, and there's kind of amazing descriptions of how the sound of the news being brought to him, and of people running to come and tell him like a kind of swelling tidal wave. Power is dead, the king is dead, long live the king. And the Dauphin is with Marie Antoinette, no longer Dauphin, it's now Louis XVI. And there are various accounts
It's
of what
taking
they say
forever.
when they're told the news, but the most celebrated one is that they fall to their knees and cry out, May God guide and protect us, for we are too young to reign.
Because they were 18 and 19, something like that. Yeah.
And I think they're aware that France faces massive problems.
My damage
But Marie
off is
Antoinette
too
later
low.
writes to Maria Theresa, her mother, and says, I cannot refrain from admiring the workings of Providence, which has chosen me,
Still
the
also
youngest
taking
of your
so much
children,
damage, so-
to occupy the finest throne in Europe. But the question is, Dominic, what will she do with that power?
Anyone could see that Marie Antoinette would dominate the new king. So says John Hardman in his book Marie Antoinette, The Making of a French Queen. Now that idea that Louis XVI, who of course is a very ill-fated, as most of our listeners will know, he ends up having an appointment with the guillotine. Is it fair to say, Tom, that he is merely her puppet? He is a weaker man, isn't he, than Marie Antoinette? And they... Well, let's talk about their relationship a bit. So do they get on? Are they a happy couple, would you say?
There are significant incompatibilities, I think it's fair to say. So we could just go through some of them. So one is attitudes to music.
Okay.
So Marie Antoinette is very, very musical. She can play the harp, she can play the harpsichord, she can play the flute. Her brother, Joseph II, who is ruling along with Maria Theresa, his mother, is the great patron of Mozart. Marie Antoinette met Mozart when they were 6 years old.
Imagine meeting Mozart at the same age. You'd feel so inadequate, wouldn't you?
Yeah, so she is very, very musical. Louis XVI is notoriously hostile to the arts and to music in particular. And this becomes a kind of topic of gossip. So in the pamphlets, it's kind of, people laugh at him for his lack of musicality.
He's like a British culture secretary.
He is. Yes, he is.
No,
That's exactly
no knowledge
what
of
he
the
is.
arts or interest in any
Yeah.
music or anything like that.
He might once have seen Star Wars, but that would be the limit of his
Yeah.
cultural engagement. Yeah, so that's pretty much where he is. And then, of course, the legendary doll that Marie Antoinette was not allowed to bring into France was an Austrian doll. This dog is called Mott. It's a pug. She's actually, this is, I think, is basically what the first tears that fall onto the bosom of the Comtesse de Noyer. Is being deprived of the dog. But listeners will be glad and relieved to know that she does, in due course, get reunited with mobs. So that's happening. Louis hates dogs, and more particularly, I'm sad to say, as a cat owner,
Yeah.
hates cats.
He's right in that regard. I hate dogs. and
No,
cats.
he's not. He's
Cats-
absolutely not.
Cats are
Because
rubbish.
he takes it to an unacceptable degree. Which is, so as Dauphin, his favourite activity is to shoot cats on the
No way, dude.
Love it.
on the roofs of
That was
Versailles.
bullshit.
So he's shooting strays.
Yeah.
And this apparently is acceptable in school inside. But he accidentally shoots the raw cat contest the multiplier. And when he does this, he's actually very upset. He apologises profusely. It's a story that does kind of, I think, sum up an aspect of his character, which is that on one level, he's very helpless. He often suffering, whether of cats or of people out in the fields of La France and so on. But on another level, when he's informed of the kind of individual examples of suffering, he's very upset about it and worried about it.
I think you're too harsh there. I don't think he's any more dangerous than anybody else.
Right, but I think if you're shooting stray cats, I mean, you just assume it's the kind of thing that he does, or it's acceptable sport. But when it's brought home to him what the implications are, then he worries about it. And I think you could say the same about his relationship to the broad troubles out in France, that he's not aware of it. He's informed about it, and then he doesn't really know what to do.
Yeah, he's not casual about it.
Yeah.
He's perhaps slightly oblivious to it. Now his big thing is hunting. He had two tremendous hunting histories: Franz Ferdinand and Kaiser,
And custom.
and Colonel 3. And actually, Louis, that would be a brilliant hunting with those four men. Because Louis XVI is a tremendous hunter. He absolutely adores it, and he keeps a journal where he writes down how many animals he's killed. So the famous thing that everybody says on the day of the fall of Bastille in 1789, that he wrote in his journal, "Rien," as if nothing happened today. That's rubbish. Actually, the nothing was because he hadn't killed any animals that day, so a very disappointing day.
I mean, I think it's also fair to say that he's not a good diarist. So on the day he meets Marie Antoinette, says, met
Right.
and the day his mother dies, he says, my mum died.
Okay. Like Sam usually my mother died or yesterday.
See a French tradition.
Yeah.
So he's not a great diarist, and as you said, he is a great huntsman. But I think that one of the reasons why he adores it so much is that he's very good at it. So he's a very good horseman. But when he's on his own feet, he's incredibly kind of maladroit. And socially, he's well assured. So when he's dancing, he's not good at kind of chit chat. He's not good at the kind of all the stuff that Versailles are doing. He doesn't really like it, and basically, he has the soul of a naval engineer.
Yeah.
So he loves fleets, he loves harbours, and he loves to
Oh,
with
I love
rocks.
it.
He has his own workshop.
Oh, I love this stuff. Simon Sharp is brilliant. So he's got this stone, hasn't he? With all these maps and nautical instruments. And he'll just sit there with a lock, like messing around, surrounded by all this. It's like a tinkering inventor. And actually, I think that comes over as quite endearing.
So Sharma wrote, right, struggle to make the perfect
Oh, shit.
It's a symbol of sublime atmosphere and monarch who repeatedly failed to make things turn as he wished. But in his abnormal people, he moved silently in his plain frock coat amidst polished lenses, artillery spears, burnished brass and orreries, with all the freedom and power of the Magus.
Oh, I love that. I mean, let me just say one thing right at the outset. Those people who have heard, or have maybe heard about it, just can't be bothered to read it because it's quite long. Simon Sharma's Big Citizens.
It's insanely enjoyable.
It's just. I mean, I know it's always tempting to be revisionist and to say a great historian of a great book. It's actually brilliant. It is a tip. It is brilliant. Every page.
And has great pictures as well.
It does.
So Marie Antoinette.
Yes, she would. She would have looked at the pictures. That's nice.
Pictures.
Yeah.
But Dom, just to say that there is an alternative perspective on this, which is the perspective of pamphleteers. One of them describes him as a zombie who spends his time making lots of bombs. And you may wonder, where is this tone coming from? Well, I think it's coming from the Prince Harry of Versailles, who is the common boss,
Right.
who is consumed with envy and spleen.
Right.
So he's feeding all kinds of kind of hostile material out to the pamphleteers. But I think it also reflects the fact that the ultimate incompatibility we see, certainly in the early years of the marriage, is sexual. And if there's one thing that a French king is supposed to do, it's to be sexually voracious. So it is better to be Louis XV, an absolute goat.
Who is this bloke's grandfather, by the way?
Yeah. Than to be sexually incompetent, which is clearly what Louis XVI is. And it takes them 7 years to make the marriage. And there was much debate at the time, and there is much debate to this day about what the problem was. So a favoured thesis is that Louis XVI suffered from a condition called phimosis, which basically means that the foreskin covers the head of the penis, which means that it's very difficult to erections become very painful. I think the consensus now, I gather, I don't quite know how they've arrived at this consensus, is that this isn't the case.
Theo has written in the chat, thanks Tom, and I'm sure many other listeners are also very grateful to you for that slightly unnecessary detail.
It's not unnecessary, because actually the question of why the king and queen are not having children is a matter of profound state.
And I think discussed, Tom, but at the highest levels.
Absolutely.
Joseph,
at the lowest level.
So Joseph II, who is the Emperor of Austria, is Marie Antoinette's brother, she must have told him about it, because he writes to another brother and says, I mean, I'm not going to go into all the gory details, but he basically says they do try to have marital relations. Louis and I quote, stays there without moving for perhaps 2 minutes, and then says goodnight.
Withdraws.
Yes.
And says,
yeah.
okay.
I was omitting that detail because I thought I'm not as keen on the. But anyway, he says goodnight. Thank you very much. All good, and they're not actually completing the necessary act. And basically, they need doctors or courtiers or whoever to explain to them.
Well, according to tradition, that comic, Joseph II makes that report after he's been on the trip to Versailles, and he's spoken to both the king and the queen. And the tradition is that he explains what needs to be done to Louis XVI with reference to a lock and a key.
Right.
You know, as a
he would enjoy the
as
lock analogy. I just find the whole thing very slightly implausible, but anyway.
And there's no question that this makes him a kind of object of some contempt, which in many ways is unfair, because I think you're right. You know, he is dutiful, he is hardworking, he is conscientious. He does develop a reputation for kindness, maybe cats accepted. But there is a sense that he is. He's a bit of a. So Chantal Thomas writes the sovereign the line in the Philippines using the cross, and I think that Louis XVI is on that line that people can admire him and respect him as a good man.
I'm rolling,
while
and you're not
simultaneously
rolling.
despising him as someone who is competent or useless as a sovereign.
He's not an impressive man. He's a charismatic or formidable man. He doesn't inspire respect. He's probably quite a nice man, but a weak man. Is that fair, Tom?
I think probably, yes. I think it's felt that he's not royal material, really. But having said that, when there is chosen to explain what he's got to do, they do finally get together, and Marie Antoinette gives Louis 4 children, including, crucially, 2 sons. So a dauphin and a spare, which is obviously very important. And they end up quite a devoted couple. So he does not, amazingly, he doesn't kill the mistress. So on one level, that of course only enhances the idea of him that he's not a kind of a libertine.
He's not an alpha male.
He's not an alpha male. But on another, he's kind of upholding an almost bourgeois standard of kind of marital fidelity. He banishes Madame du Barry, who gets packed off. And Madame du Barry, like Madame de Pompadour before her,
That was random. I literally have never seen him do that back
Grace of Favour residence on the grounds of Versailles, kind of little chateau called the Petit Trianon. And Louis gives this to Marie Antoinette. So now it's the Queen's.
Yeah.
And she absolutely loves it because, you know, we've talked about how resentful and hostile she is to the kind of stifling etiquette of Versailles. The Petit Trianon offers her a bolt hole.
Yeah.
And it gives her the perfect opportunity to vent all her, you know, qualities of spontaneity and simplicity and impulse that she loves.
So on that, you were saying about her not reading a book. Simon Sharma says in Citizens, like all adolescent girls in her generation, she drank deep in the well of sentimental literature. Her library was full of Samuel Richardson, Rousseau, Mercier, Restif de Breton, etc. Now, her library was full of them. Maybe she didn't necessarily read them. But as Sharma says, she is steeped in the culture that is the most modern, fashionable, forward-looking culture. She's not stuck in the mud. She's not a relic of the Ancien Regime. She's interested particularly in the stuff that people associate with the philosopher, the thinker Rousseau, which are virtue, simplicity, nature, a sort of, as you said, spontaneity and a kind
Yeah,
of...
and these are all qualities that will come to be seen in due course as features of the revolution. But Marie Antoinette is a massive enthusiast for them, so much so that amazingly in 1782 she goes and visits Rousseau's grave outside Paris. So she's a kind of a pilgrim.
So you think she's picked up the ideas but not read the books, basically? Is that...
I don't know. There's kind of... I don't know. I think it's perfectly possible to kind of... I think she's probably skimmed through it.
Yeah, or being told. I think that's perfectly possible too, by the way. I think it's... I mean, that's how most people actually pick up fashionable ideas, isn't it? These days, pick them up on Facebook, in conversation. You don't necessarily read the wellspring.
Yeah, and she is, for that reason, very, very fashion, because her kind of her lack of enthusiasm for fashion, as described by Versailles, is itself becomes the fashion. And the enthusiasm for Rousseau, the idea that one should lead a simple, unadorned life, and that this is the key to virtue.
Literally ran straight out.
At the Petit Trianon, the emphasis is on hiding the presence of servants. So in Versailles, it's all about having as many servants as possible. You know, the time Marie Antoinette gets dressed, but hundreds of maids surround her and do it. In the Petit Trianon, it's different. And kind of famously, she commissions a landscape architect to design her an amoristic, a kind of a rustic hamlet, a rustic village that has cows with ribbons on, alpine sheep, a water mill, and this of course becomes notorious because it's the idea of this that strikes up all kinds of unfortunate resonances. But that she is the embodiment of fashion.
But only notorious because of the revolution. I mean, and France's finances and there's no revolution.
People would be charmed by it.
Yeah, people would say, that's an entertaining quirk of 18th century, monarchical life. They wouldn't think anything of it.
Yeah, and far from saying that the portion of cake, she's very worried about the poor.
Okay.
The poor as kind of represented by photogenic paupers who can be given charity by
She's
her.
the Angelina Jolie of the 18th century, Tom.
So 1785, she
God
lodges
dang it.
and feeds 12 poor families in the Petit Trianon. But there's a quality
least I
of the
got
fact
all of it.
that she's very... I think she's very impressed by the sense she has of her own virtue.
Right.
And she wants people to know about it.
Yeah.
While simultaneously, genuinely being worried about it. I mean, all of those things can be true. And she wants to make sure that her children are raised in this. She's a very, very good mother, a very attentive mother. So 1784, the year before that, had been a terrible winter. And she provides her children with what one of her companions describes as a lesson in doing good by bringing in a great kind of pile of toys and then saying, you can't have these because we're going to sell these toys and use them to get blankets and bread amongst our need.
That's very.
So-
That's
It's
quite
very,
surprising.
very,
Yeah. It's quite
very
Dickensian.
celebrity on
I think.
Twitter.
Yeah, very Dickensian.
yeah, that as well. So Chantal Thomas describes this wonderfully. She said, she was fond of charity and never tired of the spectacle of her own goodness. So I think, again, she is a precursor of a kind of modern type of celebrity there. Kind of celebrity charity.
Duchess of Sussex, Tom.
Yes, well, yeah, a slight quality there. And so that's sort of the kind of the moral. But she also creates this kind of new kind of fashion that is absolutely repudiating the kind of stiff formality of Versailles. So she has this dressmaker, Rose Bertin, who shockingly is allowed ready access to her apartment.
Yeah.
She doesn't go through all the court protocols that normally restrict people to see the Queen. And basically, Marie Antoinette is kind of discarding all the rich silks of the court for flowing white muslins, for kind of simple costumes, fresh flowers, kind of bucolic adornments.
Right. And not only that, she stopped wearing corsets and stays and all those things really buttoned up. It's all, it's very gruesome.
Go back to nature.
It's going back to nature. I mean, Sharma says you can see the natural line. You can actually see what her body looks like under the dress, which was not the case with the incredibly rigid and structured dresses that people are wearing 10 or 20. Well, it's not they're wearing them early, they're wearing them at the same time. But she is breaking with the rules of French kind of hierarchical dress.
Absolutely, and there's a sense of, I said that Marie Antoinette in a way invents modern fashion. She does that because she whatever the French say, she is the Queen of France. So she, in a sense, is the most for that reason. She has the highest profile of any woman in Europe, but also because she's a genius at it. And the idea of waking up every morning and just deciding what you want to wear, what clothes you're going to wear, how you're going to do it, rather than having it prescribed according to the rigid structures, is something revolutionary. And it is literally revolutionary, because this is the style of fashion that will come in during the French Revolution. And Marie Antoinette, to that extent, I think is the godmother of France's modern reputation as the home of fashion.
Oh.
And it's, and it's not, and we've talked about clothes, there is also hair. So there's an absolutely wonderful book with the great title Marie Antoinette's Head by Will Bashaw, which is about her hairdresser, who is a man called Monsieur Léonard, who will feature throughout the story.
Right.
And again, this is very, very shocking that he's a male hairdresser, so not female, not a lady's maid. He's a celebrity hairdresser, and he, like Madame Bertin, has ready access to. So there's something very, very legal about this. I mean, absolutely recognisable. And he gives her a whole succession of kind of unbelievably grandiose hairstyles. So they're called the hairstyle that Marie Antoinette is initially promoting is called le pouf sentimental, which is such a and these are the ones that people will immediately
my hair is
the
sentimental poof. I mean, that's a hard sentence to carry off, right?
It's kind of you can imagine that kind of teased up gauze and plumes and things. Very, very risky because there are candles in the chandeliers, so if you brush against it might just go up in flames. And there are various kind of styles. So you have the hérisson, which is unpowdered hair. So that's kind of going back to nature there. Slight hint of going back to nature. And they're kind of curled to the tips and rising in tiers, so it looks like an hérisson, a hedgehog. There's the zephyr, which is flowers woven into the hair. So again, there's the sense that you're moving from kind of stiff formality to nature. And then in 1781, Monsieur Léonard is summoned by Marie Antoinette, who's distraught because she feels that she's losing her hair. Her hair is thinning. And Monsieur Léonard is devastated by this. And he goes away and thinks about it. And he comes back, does something revolutionary. He cuts her hair. He gives her this clear adult child's hairstyle. Yeah. And he starts to decorate it only with flowers, not with jewels. And it creates this fashion called natural hairstyle that spreads across Versailles, spreads across Paris, spreads across France, spreads across Europe.
And she has people who are around her, doesn't she? She has, you used the expression, squad, which makes sound like Taylor Swift. But she does have this coterie of very, very close friends who later become, like her, controversial. Some of them around her do incredibly tragic and lovely at the end.
Yes, I mean, so there are two in particular. The Duchess de Polignac, who is very, very beautiful, exquisite manners, absolutely adores gossip. So I think it's kind of less Taylor Swift. It's more the plastics in Mean Girls, which I know you haven't seen, but which I, as a parent of two daughters, have seen a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant film. And I think that anyone who's seen that film, if you think of Marie Antoinette and the Duchess de Polignac as the plastics, who are the kind of the queen bees in a high school, and then there's another the plastic sidekick who's trying to make fetch happen, the word fetch, which she never does. And I think that character would be the Princesse de Lamballe, who is very, very vapid. She's always so it's. There's a kind of brilliantly bitchy account of her by the Comtesse de Gemly. She never had an opinion of her own. In conversation, she always adopted the opinion of the person who passed for the wittiest in a way that was utterly unique. Whenever there was a serious discussion, she never spoke, pretending to fall into a trance. Then she would suddenly appear to snap out of her reverie and repeat word for word, as though it came from her, what the person whose opinion she had decided to adopt had just said. She affected great surprise when told someone had just said the same thing. She assured everyone she hadn't heard it. So I think you get there a sense that this is not, Marie Antoinette likes these people precisely because they are not witty, they are not brilliant. She can enjoy their company. Inevitably, gossip will say that they're all lesbians, that they're all engaging in sapphic rites. The Duchess de Polignac in particular, who becomes widely hated, but both of them are strongly disliked. There are also male guests going to the Petit Trianon, of whom the most notorious is a dashing Swedish officer called Axel von Fersen, who is the son of a field marshal and who met Marie Antoinette at a masked ball in opera in 1764 in Dauphine, when she was still Dauphine, and he hadn't recognised her, which is obviously a great thrill for Marie Antoinette.
Yeah.
From that point on, the regular visits, the two indisputably become close. Again, it's taken for granted because I think this is most unlikely.
It's not really in her character.
It's not her style.
Yeah.
No, and it would be mad for her to do that. But there is clearly a kind of heedlessness about this. I mean, to have these kind of very close relationships, and to kind of thumb her nose at the formalities and the hierarchies of Versailles, to bring down everything that the Comtesse de Noailles represented. I mean, she's building up trouble for herself.
She is. There's an amazing quotation actually from her brother, Jason, saying it's their brother. He said, she has no etiquette. She goes out and runs around alone with a few people without the outward signs of her position. She looks a little improper. And while this would be all right for a private person, she is not doing her job. And that is the issue. She's not playing the part of a French queen as the French people expect.
No, she's not. And I think what is more, even more damaging for her, is that she's actually playing the part of a mistress. Because the petit trianon is where the mistress lives, and queens are not supposed to live like mistresses. And so, over the course of Louis XVI's reign, going into the 1780s, she's coming to be hated as queens often are, as kind of, the embodiment of royal arrogance and of kind of absolutism. But she's also being hated as favourites are. She's being cast as a kind of a voracious, greedy, blood-sucking lady. Yeah. And the pair of these images are kind of being fused because a mistress is always going to use these things.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what they're there to do.
Yeah.
And kind of amazingly, the story starts to be repeated. That Marie Antoinette is literally maintaining an expensive estate, a whole tank full of leeches, which is a kind of horrible.
Yeah, sort of metaphor.
And also, this is a sexually promiscuous. So this is why the stories that she's having, satin affairs and sleeping with, Swedish officers and things like that, is why they have such.
And the interesting thing about that, Thomas, that they start, I think it's Robert Darnton makes this point, that they start in 1774, so 15 years before the Revolution, and when she's still only 18, 19 years old. So very early on, these stories that she has this kind of voracious sexuality, that her lock-obsessed husband is not satisfied, and that, there's this kind of extravagance, gravity, sucking the energy and money out of France. They start very early, don't they? She's never able to shake them.
Right, and to reiterate this is so important. These stories are not coming from Republican people who hate the monarchy. It's coming from her writers and people. These are the people who are spreading it. And it reflects culture among the nobility. And it reflects, I think, a character of libertinism that you get at court, that Louis XV had exemplified, and which you get in the closed great novel, Dangerous Liaisons, translated the film.
Too early, but it's okay.
The whole thing is the idea that the aristocracy are cruel and sexually predatory. And of course, the writer who absolutely exemplifies this is the Marquis de Sade. And there's a sense that Marquis de Sade is reworking ideas that are very, very current in pornography at the time. And Marie Antoinette, who had refused to speak to Madame Bovary,
unbelievable,
she'd been a courtesan, who had been so unsexually voracious that she, the marriage hadn't been consummated for 7 years. She comes to be the kind of the protagonist of pornographic fantasies that are increasingly revolting and shocking in the way that the Marquis de Sade's writings are revolting and shocking. And listeners may be wondering, does any of this matter? And it does matter, because it comes to threaten the reputation not just of the Queen, but of the King and of the monarchy itself. The thing is that in the early 1780s, all these rumours and stories and fantasies, they lack an obvious focus. They are underground. They are being perpetrated by kind of court rivalries. But then in 1784, there's an absolute catastrophe, because Marie Antoinette finds herself engulfed in a firestorm of scandal. And actually, Dom, it's not just a scandal, it's an affair. The affair of the diamond necklace.
Tom, what an amazing story this is. Thank you so much for that. And I think there's only one expression, given that we are in 18th century France. That was the genuine Lord of the Books. And on that bombshell, au revoir everybody. À demain. Today's episode is about the scandal of the diamond necklace. So before we get into the diamond necklace and what it means for Marie Antoinette, for Louis XVI and for the French Revolution, tell us why you've chosen to kick off with the marriage of Figaro and what is going on.
So the marriage of Figaro, which if people haven't seen the play, they may have seen the opera, which was adapted by Mozart, and it tells the story of the wedding day of Figaro, who is the servant of a lecherous and arrogant Spanish count called Count Almaviva. And Figaro has just got married to Suzanne, who is the maid of the Countess, the Count's wife. And the Count, who is, he makes Louis XV, who we had in the previous episode, look at an absolute model of chastity. He wants to exercise the traditional droit de seigneur over Suzanne, so the right of a lord to bed whoever of his dependents he wants to. And all kinds of farcical shenanigans ensue, Dominic.
Love a farcical shenanigans.
Lots of cross-dressing, lots of hiding in cupboards, jumping out of windows, all kinds of things like that. But the plot ends up in a garden by night, and the Countess and Suzanne have kind of teamed up, and they've got this plan to basically publicly humiliate the Count and kind of get him to reform out of shame. And so to that end, they swap clothes so that the Count will mistake his wife, the Countess, for the maid, Suzanne, and vice versa. So it's a kind of classic French farce. And Figaro is worried that Suzanne is going to sleep with the Count, even though they've just got married. He's furious about it. He's very upset that the Count is behaving understandably. And he also thinks that Suzanne is betraying him. So he's assembled a large crowd to catch the Count and Suzanne in flagrante, because he thinks this is what's going to happen. But it all ends very happily.
Hurrah!
So, because Suzanne is very indignant at Figaro, because they reveals the whole plot to him. The couple are reconciled. They have a kiss. The Count sees them kissing and thinks that Figaro is getting off with his wife, the Countess. Absolutely explodes, orders them all to be arrested. The crowd summoned by Figaro kind of assemble on the stage to with flaming torches and everything. At this point, the Countess emerges and reveals who she is. The Count reveals the Count realizes that he's been an absolute bounder, that he's been tricked. And there's a long pause, and then he falls to his knees and begs for forgiveness. Perhaps in the opera, it's a stunningly beautiful moment. And the Countess does forgive him, and everyone is forgiven. And the last line of the play is, everything finishes with songs. So there's this idea of class tensions and the iniquities of the aristocracy.
We did it!
But at the time,
my
this
goodness.
play by Bernard Shaw, 1784. Incredibly controversial.
What a
unbelievably.
It was seen as so radical in that it was upturning the social order. There are lots of jokes and remarks and allusions to censorship, or the way the justice system works, or the fear of being locked up in the Bastille.
Yeah.
And it's now, when in Robert Darnton's brilliant book, The Revolutionary Temper, there's a whole chapter about the controversy about the marriage of Figaro and how that foreshadows the revolution.
Yeah, and this is the. People listening to that praise, they were able to keep track of it. They may be wondering, how could a farce like this have this kind of incredible reputation? I mean, it had it at the time, and it had it in the Revolution. So Danton, who we'll be coming to, one of the great revolutionary leaders, he says of it, it killed off the nobility. I mean, you might think actually it's the guillotine that does that, but Danton says no, it's the marriage of Figaro. And Napoleon says of the play, because we remember we did the episodes on the young Napoleon, didn't we? He loved a play.
Yeah.
And he said that, this is the revolution in action avant la révolution. This is what the revolution is going to become.
Right.
So the obvious question then, if it is as incendiary as contemporaries thought, how on earth did it come to be staged? And not only come to be staged, but become, unbelievably famous. It kind of in the way that a blockbusting Hollywood movie today might be, kind of going completely viral, copied, parodied. So, the fact that Mozart turns it into an opera within 2 years of it being premiered is a kind of indication of the cultural cachet that it has, and the celebrity and indeed the notoriety. And the truth is that the difficulty of getting it on stage becomes part of Beaumarchais' marketing strategy. So he gives the finished script to the Comédie Française in 1781, and they say, yeah, this is brilliant. So it's the sequel to an earlier play that had also featured Figaro and the Count. So they're very keen to put it on, but it takes them 3 years to get on. And the reason for that is that the king is massively offended by it. He calls it detestable, and he repeatedly tries to ban it. But he reckons without two things, and one of them is Beaumarchais himself, who is an amazing figure, incredibly charismatic, extraordinary life. He'd been a royal agent in London. He'd been sent there to protect Madame du Barry from the Louis XV's mistress from a libelous pamphlet. He'd had all kinds of dealings with the Chevalier d'Eon, who is a diplomat who people think may even have been female, but kind of cross-dresser. And again, kind of cross-dressing is a kind of theme throughout The Marriage of Figaro. He ends up running guns to the Americans. He publishes the complete works of Voltaire, the great wit and philosophe. So an amazing guy, and is brilliant at self-publicity. And he uses the censorship battle to publicise the play. And he's able to do this by exploiting what we were talking about in the previous episode, that there are different factions in the court. And lots of the nobility who are opposed to the stuffiness of the king think it's very, very funny to get the play on. And one of the people who thinks it's funny to get the play on is the Queen herself,
so Marie
Antoinette,
who we talked about the last time, who's been behaving in a way that they think is not suitable for a queen because of her love of the kind of Rousseauist nature and simplicity and stuff.
Yeah.
And because she's kind of got a girlishness to her, a lightness, and French queens are meant to be heavy. And she thinks it's hilarious, doesn't she? She thinks it's really funny.
So Simon Sharma in Citizen says, the more outrageous the denunciations of the established order, the better the Queen liked it.
And that's because the people that she doesn't get on with at the court are the kind of rigid, formal, old guard kind of people.
Yeah.
And they're the kind of people, to some degree, who don't like this play and are being mocked by it, right? So she's naturally on the side of lightness and laughter, Tom.
Absolutely. And one of the king's brothers, so not the Comte de Provence, who is the kind of particularly embittered one, but the younger brother, the Comte d'Artois, who's very close to Marie Antoinette. I mean, he loves it as well. He pushes for it to be on. And so it becomes a massive, massive succès d'estime, not just among, the ordinary mass of theatre goers, but among the nobility. And again, Sharma, in his account of this, quotes an aristocrat, Henriette de Freudenstein, who describes all the aristocrats in the audience slapping themselves on their own cheeks, laughing at their own expense, and even worse, making others laugh too, a strange blindness.
So that's The Marriage of Figaro. But what nobody knows when they're laughing along, slapping their cheeks or whatever they're doing, what nobody knows is that in just a few weeks' time, there will begin an affair, scandal, that makes the story of The Marriage of Figaro, the farcical goings-on, look humdrum and unfunny and colourless by comparison. And this is the beginning of this tremendous scandal, the affair of the diamond necklace, Tom. And this kicks off, I think, am I right in saying, on the 11th of August, 1784, so just a few months later.
Yeah, so The Marriage of Figaro has premiered in the spring of 1784, and as you say, on the 11th of August, something happens, an event happens that weirdly echoes the kind of the climactic scene in The Marriage of Figaro, but kind of, as you said, ramps it up to a scandalous degree. So that evening, a milliner, a Parisian milliner called Nicole Leguet, who has been reduced to prostitution by the exactions of loan sharks, or so she says, is driven to Versailles. And to quote Jonathan Beckman, who is not only a historian but plays cricket with me in The Authors, but I'm not just saying this, has written a brilliant account of the whole scandal, How to Ruin a Queen. His description of Nicole: she was young, pretty and broke, and with her broad forehead, her straight chiselled nose and her small protuberant mouth, she resembled Dominic, no one so much as Marie Antoinette. So she gets driven to Versailles, And she's greeted there by a woman who calls herself the Vicomtesse de Valois, who tells Nicole something amazing, that the Queen has personally requested that her, Nicole, do the Queen a favour, and that in return Nicole will be given 15,000 livres, which is a lot of money for an impecunious prostitute. And more than that, because she's doing the Queen a favour, she will be given a title. The Vicomtesse de Valois says that from this point on, Nicole will be known as the Baronne d'Oliva, and that is O-L-I-V-A, which is kind of an anagram of Valois, almost an anagram of Valois.
That's hilarious.
Chances.
So
Did not see that.
Nicole's
Did not know
suspicions
that
are
was
not
there.
aroused by this, it has to be said at the time. In fact, she's just incredibly bewildered, but I mean,
think
the
I'll
chance
just
to have
kill
a title and
Hopefully
lots of money,
Yeah,
I mean,
why wouldn't you take it?
what's not to like? So the next day, she stayed at Versailles. The next day, she's dressed in a kind of a plain but expensive white muslin dress. And people who heard our previous episodes will know that this is the kind of signature costume of Marie Antoinette herself. And she's given a demi-bonnet which covers her face, but kind of enables people to see her lips. The Vicomtesse then hands, let's call her d'Oliva, because that's now her title, a tiny letter, and says that she is going to lead her into the park at Versailles, into one of the gardens, and that when she gets there, a noble seigneur will be waiting, and she's to hand this letter over, plus a rose. And that as she hands the letter and the rose over, she is to say to this seigneur, "You know what this means." That's all she has to do.
Yeah.
And so at midnight, the Baronne d'Oliva, as she seems to have become, is taken out into the gardens, and she is told, as she's being led, that the Queen is watching her to make sure that she does everything that the Queen is requesting. So the Baronne d'Oliva, Nicole, aka Nicole the Queen's milliner, is standing in the gardens. You know, the kind of roses around, the faint splashing of fountains in the distance, the stars are blazing in the sky. And not long afterwards, she sees a man approaching, and this is a man in a long black cassock and a very kind of broad-brimmed, floppy hat. He comes up to her, and the poor Baronne is terrified. You know, she doesn't know who this person is. She's in the royal gardens. What's going on? But she kind of summons up her courage, and she hands over a rose. And she says, as she's been instructed to do, "You know what this means." She's just about to hand over the letter when there's suddenly a kind of an uproar, the torches in the distance, the sound of footsteps coming, and the Baronne's arm is grabbed, pulled into the bushes. It's the Vicomtesse who's got hold of her, hurries her back, takes her into her private quarters, and the Baron d'Oliva, Nicole, apologises that he hasn't been able to hand over the letter, but nobody seems to care. Instead, there's a big meal, the wine flows, and they go to bed. And in the morning, the Vicomtesse shows Nicole, the Baron d'Oliva, a letter that she has received from Marie Antoinette, and she reads the letter out. "I'm very happy, my dear Countess, with the person you procured for me. She played her role to perfection." At this point, the Vicomtesse rips up the letter because she says it is not the kind of letter that one should carry around. So there is no evidence for any of this that's happened. The Vicomtesse then hands over a third of the fee that's been promised, and then the Baron d'Oliva is driven back into Paris. From this point on, there is no further reference to her title, so she goes back to being Nicole, and there is no further money. And that seems to be the end of the matter. I mean, all very, very strange.
And this is from Nicole's own account.
This is
So
from Nicole.
everything
Well, it's
you're
from the
gonna
account
hear-
of her lawyer.
Yeah, everything you're going to hear in this story comes from the accounts given by different lawyers who would publish to make money. They would publish memoirs of what their clients had told them.
But also,
this is-
Dominic, to be fair, to try and get some content.
Yes, of course. So this is
they're all-
Nicole's story. So Tom, a very kind of Mozart-friendly episode.
Isn't it?
This.
It's very, very
The Queen
Mozart.
looking on, presumably a mysterious suitor in the darkness, the rose is handed over, all of this kind of thing.
I mean, it's made for an opera.
Yeah, turn on the lights for us and tell us, first of all, who is that mysterious man in the cassock that the Queen appears to be giving a rose to?
Well, he is an amazingly important figure in the French noble hierarchy. He's a man called Louis de Roque, and he is a scion of the grandest non-royal family in France. So he traces his lineage back to the one-time kings of Brittany. And so he has the Rohan have this phrase, "Ranu qui fascinate Rohas." I cannot be king. I won't be prince. I am Rohan.
Right.
So I think it's better for Rohan to be a king or a prince.
Theoden would agree with that.
Of course. And in his role as a Rohan, he gets to inherit the bishopric of Strasbourg, which brings with it a cardinal alert. The cardinal, so he becomes, in 1779, he inherits this, and he becomes the Cardinal de Rohan. And in his character, he's he's a very generous man, but in other ways, I mean, he's the kind of person who would very easily be taken in by a confidence trickster.
He's basically a
fair to
character
say.
from a sort of Ben Jonson play or something, or a Molière play.
He's the kind of person who, if he got an email from someone saying, "I need your your passport details and £100,000, please send it here," he would do it. Yeah. So there was an abbé who'd been at the seminary with him, but when they were young, who remembered him as haughty, inconsiderate, unreasonable spendthrift, not very bright, fickle in his tastes and his friendships. But as I say, he does have two good qualities. He's very generous, and Dominic, he's an Anglophile. So these are positives.
Won't hear a word against him.
The problem is, though, that he has infuriated Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette hates him. And the reason for that is he'd gone to Vienna as ambassador. And because he's an Anglophile, he doesn't really like the Austrians. And he's always writing rude letters about Maria Theresa, Marie Antoinette's mother, to his confidants at Versailles. And one of them reads out something rude he said about Maria Theresa, and it gets back to Marie Antoinette. So she's very upset about this. And he's also gone around, when he comes back from Vienna, he's at Versailles, he loves a bit of gossip, he's not very bright. He goes around accusing Marie Antoinette of having an affair with the Comte d'Artois, the younger brother.
It's very reckless.
Yeah, it's mad. And also he says of the Queen, she displays a coquettishness that prepares the way for an accomplished lover to succeed with her. Again, mad.
Yeah, well,
so
it's foolish, and he lets his tongue run away with it, clearly.
And people who've seen Dangerous Liaisons or read the book, the book by Leclos, written at exactly this period. This is exactly what's going on. It's people kind of gossiping about each other, overhearing it, reading letters that aren't meant for them, all this kind of thing. Yeah. So it's absolutely part of the climate. But the Cardinal de Rohan is not smart enough, really, to profit from it. And so
pretty bad at
he's distraught that he feels that now that Marie Antoinette is standing in the way of him getting the kind of promotion that he feels should be his right as a Rohan. So he'll do anything to try and get her back. And it's at this point that an impecunious woman with a sob story approaches him.
Yeah.
And this is a woman called Jeanne de Lamotte. And she claims descent from the Valois, who are the traditional royal family who kind of gone extinct in the 16th century,
that's
been replaced by the Bourbons.
That's obviously just rubbish to appeal to the Cardinal, isn't it? She's a swindler.
Well, this is the story. This is her story. And she approaches the Cardinal for some charity, which the Cardinal gives her, and almost certainly they have an affair.
How does that work? I'd like some charity. Oh, my dear. I've got some charity upstairs. Come through.
I think that's exactly how it works.
Right.
I think that's, yeah. So the Cardinal is a notorious womanizer, as cardinals in the Ancien Régime tend to be.
They've got to be my lord, sure.
So having done that, Lamotte then thinks, do you know what? I'm going to aim higher. And she wants to get, amazingly, quarters in Versailles. And so she persuades the Cardinal to introduce him to one of the sisters of Louis XVI. And Lamotte has prepared for this moment very, very skillfully. So she's introduced to the sister of Louis XVI, and she faints. She's kind of overcome. Whether this is staged or whether it's real, who knows? But the consequence of this is that she is seen as an unfortunate who has suffered terrible things and therefore needs to be helped. And this plays into the spirit of kind of sentimentality that is and sensibility that is absolutely kind of current and associated with Marie Antoinette and her kind of her vibe at Versailles. And so she gets these quarters, and she then starts using this. She starts telling the Cardinal that she's become great friends with the Queen herself.
The Queen does have her, you referred to in the last episode, as her squad. So it's not it's not that impossible. I mean, it could happen that she could become.
So the cardinal completely believes it, and Lamotte then starts saying, the only way to get to Marie Antoinette's heart is to buy her the most notorious necklace in France. It had been made by court jewellers Burma and Bassange, who had been commissioned by Louis XV to make it's called kind of slave necklace, because it looks like a kind of collar slave might wear. It consists of 647 diamonds, and these weigh 2,800 carats. So, it is massively vulgar.
Yeah.
And so Jonathan Beckman describes it as grotesque and almost literally unbearable. It more resembles an item of chainmail or something a monk might wear in penitential self-chastisement than covered in a piece of jewels.
It's a necklace that Donald Trump could buy for a lady.
Yeah, for a porn star, perhaps, particularly trying to acquire it. And unfortunately, the jewellers had never been able to give this to Madame du Barry because Louis XV had died, and so therefore Madame du Barry had been chucked down to Versailles and wanted to buy it. And so they're stuck with this enormous bid, and they need to sell it to someone. And so the obvious person is Marie Antoinette. So they keep saying, Your Majesty, would you like to buy this? And it's not Marie Antoinette's style at all. It's kind of vulgar and
I think it's nature and simplicity and pearl, 40 pearls, and no corsets and all that stuff.
And on top of that, of course, it's been made for Madame du Barry. So it kind of had, it's not just vulgar, it has associations with kind of courtesans.
Yeah.
So absolutely not her. And also, she has been warned by both her mother and her husband, the king, to stop displaying the bling, that it's not going down well. And also with Monsieur Léonard, who we talked about, the hairdresser, he has been phasing jewels out from her hairstyle, going for the natural flowers. So basically, it's not her thing at all. She does not want it. So you might think, well, couldn't the cardinal have done some cursory research on this? And he'd realised this is a mad thing. Marie Antoinette would never have wanted this necklace. But it's at this point, Dominic, that another figure steps into the story, and this is someone you're very keen on, isn't it? It's an Italian occultist called, supposedly, the Comte de Cagliostro.
Yeah, so his story is enough to take up multiple podcasts, but just to absolutely condense it, he told multiple different stories. Some of them he said he was the son of the master of the Knights of Malta, or a bigwig from Egypt, or from an Ottoman pasha. There were stories that he was 300 years old, that he was...
No, even longer.
That he was 3,000
maybe 2,000,
years old.
3,000 years old.
Yeah, stories that he'd been at the wedding in Cana in the Bible with Jesus and co. Basically, what seems to be the truth is that in reality, either he was born in Sicily, in the slums of Palermo, into a Jewish family, or he's the son of a coachman from Naples. We don't know which. He seems to have had time as an apprentice hairdresser.
A lot of hairdressers behaving badly.
And then he basically becomes a swindler, professional charlatan. He goes around, he says he's dreamed up a special Egyptian form of Freemasonry. He's got a fake countess wife, and she sells a package basically to aristocratic ladies. And he seems to have come into contact with the cardinal in Strasbourg in 1784. And the cardinal, as you said, Tom, is an absolute duke. Yeah. I mean, that's the whole thing about being counter.
Okay.
And that he believes all this stuff about Freemasonry, the occult. He believes that Cagliostro is an alchemist. And there are stories, aren't there? And I think they're probably not true, but there are stories that Cagliostro was in on the plot and held seances and occult rituals to persuade Rohan, the Cardinal de Rohan, that the stuff about the necklace is true and that this is the way to Marie Antoinette's heart.
And of course, the thing is, always with confidence tricks, is that people have to want desperately to believe that what they're being told is the case. And it's not just the cardinal who wants to believe it; the jewellers do as well, because they want to recoup their investment. So, November 1784. So this is a few months after the meeting in the gardens at Versailles. The cardinal gets a letter that has been signed Marie Antoinette de France, which is a signature she would never use because that's not diplomatic at all, and the cardinal, as a former diplomat, should have known this, but he doesn't. Mm-hmm. And in this letter he gets informed that the cardinal is to acquire the necklace for the Queen, and that the Queen will pay for it in 4 instalments. So brilliant. The jewellers are delighted, the cardinal is delighted, he's way back. So on the 29th of January 1785, the jewellers give the cardinal the necklace. A courier then arrives who claims to be from the Queen.
Yeah,
The cardinal gives the necklace to this courier.
What a fool that cardinal is.
Do you think it's the courier, Dominic? It's not.
No, who is it? Tell us who it is. Surprise us.
It's one of Lamotte's lovers.
Yeah, it's astounding.
And he goes away. He gives it to Lamotte's husband. So that's very markedly bizarre. Lots of. So the husband then breaks it up, and he starts trying to fence the diamonds around Paris. But it's obviously dangerous to be doing this in Paris. He then goes to London and starts doing it there. Meanwhile, of course, the jewellers are waiting for their money, and the cardinal is waiting for signs of the Queen's favour that he's been promised. And he goes to court, and he's kind of waiting to see the Queen with the necklace. Absolutely nothing. So, early July, he thinks, I've got to see what's going on. So he sends Marie Antoinette a discreet note, kind of saying, very much looking forward to seeing these, wink, wink, what you, hey, nudge, nudge. And Marie Antoinette is his man.
Yeah, of course.
So it's the letter, of course. Early in August, the jewellers are so desperate, because they're now facing bankruptcy, that they go to one of Marie Antoinette's ladies-in-waiting and say, look, where's this money that the Queen promised us? And they go to the Queen, and she's got no idea that any of this has been going on. And Marie Antoinette leads the investigation. Personally, understandably, she's appalled. I mean, she's completely innocent, yet her good name has been consistently abused throughout the entire affair. And she has this kind of dramatic declaration of purpose. Hideous vices must be unmasked. The purple of a cardinal and the title of a prince have cloaked a money grabber, a fraudster who dares to compromise the wife of his sovereign. France and all of Europe shall know of it. And so she goes to the king, and the king issues orders that the cardinal be arrested. And so he is on the 15th of August, and he is arrested while he is celebrating. He's holding mass to celebrate the Ascension of the Virgin in the chapel at Versailles. He's in his full robes, smoke, bells, the works. In come the king's guards. He's arrested and taken off to the Bastille.
Crikey, Tom. What a story this is. Napoleon Bonaparte in later life said that the death of Marie Antoinette began at the trial of the diamond necklace conspirators. And Tom, that's a big claim from Napoleon. I mean, who am I to argue with Napoleon?
Yeah.
Now, why would
he was there?
Why would one say that of something that on the surface seems a little bit inconsequential, and of course, in which the Queen's not really involved?
Right, because, I guess people said, well, of course, the French Revolution, a scandal about a necklace would be low down the list. Very common. Yeah. Bread riots, fiscal incompetence, all kinds of things, which we will be looking at in due course. I think that the answer to why it is so damaging to the Queen is the way that the scandal comes to be teased out and the way that it goes public.
Yeah.
So what happens is that all the main participants in the scandal, so the Cardinal, Nicole, aka the Baron d'Oliva, the Comte de Cagliostro, and of course de la Motte, they're all arrested and they're all brought to trial. And the trials that they have are open. So, the proceedings can be reported. And so this means that the Queen had said all of France and Europe shall hear of this. This is exactly what happens, but it doesn't work to her advantage.
Well, just on that, so the openness, I think it's important that people get a sense of what an enormous appetite for news and gossip there is in Paris, in particular, in the 1780s. So we mentioned earlier Robert Darnton's brilliant book, The Revolutionary Temper, and he talks in that about how all the different lawyers, we mentioned this in the first half time, but the different lawyers and the various participants publish these, what they call these memoirs of the case while the case is going on. And these would go through multiple editions, and they would sell tens of thousands of copies, and people would literally read them out in cafes. People would gather to read them together as a collective experience of the news, rumour, gossip. And this case is the perfect story for all that, and it actually ties together all these anxieties and sort of fantasies about Marie Antoinette that have been gathering pace for more than a decade. Go on.
And I think a kind of closest parallel I can think of that from modern times
Oh.
would be the way in which the failure of the marriage of Prince Charles and Diana kind of exploded. There was gossip about it, there were whisperings about it, there was talk about it, and then suddenly it was all brought out into the open, and there was this absolute kind of firestorm obsession. And I think that is basically what happens, and it's devastating for Marie Antoinette and for the crown generally, because all the protagonists in various ways come to be exonerated. 3 of them are legally exonerated. 4 of them are kind of basically exonerated before the bar of public opinion. And so the crown is left completely baffled and perplexed and wounded by this. So to go through the various, the participants in these trials, 3 of them, all of whom have been sent to the Bastille, and to be sent to the Bastille in this period, to go to the Bastille is the symbol of royal oppression. So it kind of immediately makes them heroes. People are instinctively on their side. So the cardinal, when he goes to the Bastille, he is probably cast as a kind of victim of royal oppression. He becomes the people's cardinal.
But the thing is, Simon Chalmers and Citizens, he actually moved into a specially furnished apartment outside the prison where he spent 9 months entertaining a stream of distinguished visitors. Oysters and champagne were laid on as a collation for guests, and the cardinal was allowed choice works from his library and a retinue of servants to help him overcome the hardships of incarceration.
But the image is that they're, dripping water and clanking chains and rats and straw and everything. But it's not at all like that.
Yeah.
And he says that he doesn't want the king to try it, basically because he doesn't trust the king. And so he says he wants to go to the Parlement de Paris. And the Parlement it's not a parliament, it's kind of like the High
Court,
And so he goes on court there, it's open, and the lawyer, his lawyer, presents him as, a kind of Rousseau-esque figure. A figure, who has, an excess of candour. He's at one with nature. He's not suited to the machinations of a corrupt and decadent court. He's Mother Nature's child, all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And also, he just wanted to serve the Queen. It's his chivalrous duty.
He's been made a fool of in this story, but he's not a conspirator, he's not a criminal. So they were right.
So there is a measure of truth there. And so he does get acquitted. But the implications of this are devastating for Marie Antoinette. And Jonathan Beckman spells it out. Louis and Marie Antoinette can scarcely believe that Parlement had, in effect, ruled that the Queen could be mistaken for the kind of woman who might arrange a midnight assignation, buy a ruinously expensive necklace without her husband's permission, and correspond in secret with a known roue.
Right, because if you're assuming that he could be easily fooled, then you're assuming that the possibility exists that he could behave like this. And then we know, you and I know, and everybody who's read the books on her knows that she would never have behaved like this, but the French public have been primed to think that she might.
Yeah, absolutely. And he retires to Strasbourg, where he's greeted as a kind of, an oppressed innocent.
Yeah.
So that's him. Nicole, the Baron d'Oliva, the account that we gave, as we said, is that's basically derives from the lawyer that she has, who essentially casts her as the kind of heroine of a novel. Yeah. And if it sounded like a novel, then I think there may be a kind of element of that. But I think the basic outline of what happened is true, but clearly it's been kind of slightly. I
mean, she is a victim.
Harmed.
She is a victim of it. Really, she's
been
made a tool.
Yes,
she's been made.
She is
a dupe. Yeah.
And what makes the people even more sympathetic is that in the Bastille she's giving birth to a baby, so that makes it more of a kind of sentimental heroine of a Rousseau novel. The Comte Cagliostro, he has. So in the Bastille, he continues to play the part of the magus, the man who's about 3,000 years old. So there's brilliant details in the interrogation of the Bastille. He's asked, do you have any regrets about the life that you've led? And Cagliostro replies, I feel terrible about the assassination of Pompey the Great and my role in that. Pompey the Great, the great rival of Julius Caesar, who killed 2,000 years before. So that's brilliant. But once he gets to his trial, he immediately switches round and suddenly casts himself as a kind of cool Enlightenment skeptic. And he gets asked by the prosecution lawyer, why do you say that you're 1,000 years old? He says, I'm not, I'm 37.
Yeah. So there are lots of the stories about Cagliostro, to be fair, come from like pamphlets about him. He thinks himself so the public great story. I mean, he probably either said it as a joke or didn't say it. I mean, anyway, he's a good character. I like him. And actually, the government account, which was by a barrister called Tajay, which was he wrote a memoir, and it was the government approved of, basically said Cagliostro had nothing to do with this. He was like dragged in as exciting as press, but he wasn't really. He was apparently in Lyon when the whole thing was taking place anyway, so he probably...
Difficult to know because there are so many kind of rival. He's such a fraud.
Yeah.
That I don't think you can trust anything that he says. So it's difficult to know. But I mean, anyway, he gets off. I mean, people agree that he doesn't have anything to do with it. As for Jeanne de la Motte, the confidence trickster, she is convicted. The evidence against her is overwhelming. I mean, she's basically banged to rights. But amazingly, even she wins public sympathy.
Yeah.
And she does this by essentially her defence is that everything that she said was true, that Marie Antoinette was guilty, that she had wanted the necklace, that she had written loads of letters, that she was in Versailles. So she gets sentenced to life imprisonment in the Salpêtrière, which is it's a kind of former munitions factory, isn't it? That is notorious as the place where prostitutes get sent.
It's basically a prostitute's prison.
So she gets taken there, and she hasn't been told before the sentence is read to her what she's going to suffer. So she's taken to the prison. It's read out to her. She's told that she's going to be birched, branded, and be imprisoned for life. And she goes absolutely ballistic. She starts kind of scratching and writhing. Yeah. She bites a chunk out of the executioner. She kind of swallows his flesh, so it is said. And she's pinned down, and the branding iron has V on it, voleurs, a thief. One of the brands is successfully printed, but the other one she's twisted so much that it burns her breast. It's kind of stench of roasted meat. So very, very horrible. She's then taken inside. She's given a kind of pudding bowl, so all her hair is chopped off, and then she's put into a rough grey dressing dress and locked up. And amazingly, in 1787, so only a couple of years later, she escapes. And immediately it's assumed that this is all part of a conspiracy, that the Queen wants her out of the way. And then there may be an element of the fact, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's possible, who knows. Anyway, she gets to London, and when she's there, she writes this venomous, slanderous attack on the Queen. She claims to have had a sapphic relationship with Marie Antoinette. She describes midnight assignations with the Queen. Heavens, I found her so beautiful. I said to myself, it is the goddess Flora toying with a humble little flower. So the idea of Marie Antoinette as predatory, as domineering.
Has groomed her.
Has groomed her, yes, exactly. And Chantal Thomas says of her, she was the Justine of the pre-revolutionary epic. And Justine is the heroine of the Marquis de Sade's most famous novel. Justine is impeccably virtuous, and because she is virtuous, she is persecuted by the kind of Sardian mobsters, the aristocrats, and essentially this is, if she is the Justine, then Marie Antoinette is a kind of Sardian monster.
Simon Chalmers she represented herself as orphan, heroin, innocent, not astray. That's the same one, isn't it? The corrupted. She's an innocent, rather like Nicole, the person who she's actually corrupted by. But in this case, she has been corrupted personally. And of course, that may seem bonkers. We know, we discussed so brilliantly in the last episodes on that Marie Antoinette is actually quite. She's not puritanical, but she's very bourgeois in her.
No, I don't think she's bourgeois, but I think she's a
sexual morality.
She's a combination. She's Catholic and she's Rousseauian.
Right.
She's a combination of kind of old school Catholic morality combined with a kind of girlish giddiness, a kind of love of the
fair enough.
Flowers.
But what she is she is not a predatory lesbian sort of groom up girls or young women or whatever that this woman's playing.
But the problem is that these are portrayals of her that have already gained traction. That she's a monster of extravagance, and that she's a kind of predatory whore. And the reason this scandal is so devastating is both that it amplifies those stories and that it makes them kind of very, very public. And so in the wake of it, you start to get the portrayal of her as a kind of monstrous nymphomaniac is completely turbocharged. So by 1789, and we all know what happens in 1789, a pamphlet is published which describes the sexual record: nobility, clergy, third estate. So that this is the backdrop to the meeting of the three estates, which we'll be doing in due course. So it's obviously inspired by it. Any man has a right to her favours. The most handsome and robust are the most welcome. Guards, lackeys, actors, height of opprobrium. Oh, indelible shame.
Yeah.
So, kind of loving it. And it's not just the Queen who gets caught up on this, so also does her female favourite. So this is when the stories about the Duchess de Polignac, who we talked about yesterday, one of her squad, they get vituperative as well. I mean, she's the Duchess de Polignac's relatively harmless, so is the Princess de Lambert. But they are both cast as kind of co-vampires in Marie Antoinette's nymphomaniac cover.
Queens of Vice, Tom.
Queens of Vice, yeah, absolutely. And what's fascinating is that in the wake of the punishment of de la Motte, you start to get fantasies in which Marie Antoinette and her favourites suffer similar punishments. So a lampoon is published against the Duchess de Polignac, and it kind of says, let's see her humiliated, let's see her punished, let's see her suffer before the gaze of the people. Yes, madame, you must do penance, and as the choice is up to the professor, here is the penance I'm proposing in the name of nature. Shave your head, don a grey Hessian dress as your only adornment, and go to the august assembly of the Estates General in this garb to make atonement and deliver up any remains of your plundering. So it's kind of working with, the punishments of convicted prostitutes.
And also the Austrianness is really important here, isn't it? Because there are two claims additional to this. One that's very common is that she actually, her first victim, as it were, or the first person who perhaps groomed her, was her own brother, the Austrian Emperor Joseph II.
Yeah.
And of course,
to pursue the Mozart thing, he's the too many notes king.
Yes. But then the other thing is, of course, that if she is Austrian, then she's not French, and she must therefore be a traitor. And the more that the international temperature kind of rises, especially once the revolution has got going, the more people say, she is not merely sexually kind of depraved, she's politically depraved, and she must be, in the course of her sapphic lusts, she is absorbing secrets, passing these secrets to Francis Hands.
Yes, exactly so. And there's a sense that Maria Theresa, her mother, has sent them as a kind of to infect France with her villainy. So you may wonder, well, how on earth does Marie Antoinette cope with this abuse? And the truth is that she treats it all with abuse this day. So as early as 1775, she wrote to Maria Theresa's mother, saying, we're in the middle of a satirical song. They have made some up about everyone at court, men and women alike. French licenses even extended to the king. I myself have not been spared. Although this country is fond enough of malice, the songs are so flat and in such bad taste that they are successful neither with the public or high society.
So two things. One, she's only 20 years old when she says that. So I always find the stuff about Marie Antoinette actually unbelievably positive. I mean, I just think how you can take the side of the pamphleteers and not of basically the girls beyond. But the other interesting thing is that she is quite wrong about it. So when she says successful neither with the public nor high society, she is dead wrong. They are enormously successful, and a lot of people, if you say it often enough, people will believe it.
Yeah, and so Chantal Thomas in her wonderful book about the pamphlets and Marie Antoinette's relationship to them, I mean, she basically says that one of the reasons perhaps why they don't impinge on Marie Antoinette is that she simply doesn't understand the power of the written word. That
because she doesn't read.
Yeah, she doesn't really read, and she says Marie Antoinette had nothing to learn from the outside world. The hot-headed, vehement words of the pamphlets were incomprehensible to her, and so failed to touch her. But there are expressions of of public hostility that do have an impact. So in May 1785, and this is when the scandal is kind of really building up, she goes to Paris and the people there refuse to cheer her. And 2 years later, she's being booed and hissed on the streets of Paris.
Tom, you say that, but actually Theo, our producer, will tell you that people aren't booing and hissing. They are shouting out, ooh, ooh, and cheat, cheat, cheat. That's their equivalent to hissing.
That's French for boo.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so one of the chiefs of police in Paris writes to the king of Versailles and says that the queen shouldn't go into the capital, it's unsafe for her. And so Louis XVI passes on his wife and forbids her to go to Paris. And Marie Antoinette is deeply wounded by this, and so she cancels her public engagements in the capital, and she basically retreats to the Petit Trianon, which of course then only makes the stories, because what's she up to in there with all her her girlfriends and terrible.
And the irony is that she cannot win. That she's in a position now where whatever she does will be seen as evidence of guilt. So ironically, the fact that she tried to be less formal is seen as she's not a good queen. The fact that she's got a group of friends, she's a lesbian. All of the fact that she's not going into the city because she's being booed, that shows she's arrogant. She doesn't care.
Or a traitor.
Yeah. She cannot win. I'm really sorry.
And so you may wonder, well, does this matter? Does any of this matter? Does Serpent's Frog? It does matter, because it doesn't just damage the queen. It also, the whole scandal of the diamond necklace has also seriously, for the first time, damaged the public reputation of the king. Again, there have been kind of rumours bubbling under the surface, but again, it is this trial that brings slanders against the king to the surface. And there are two things that they focus. The first is that he is cast as a despot. He is the man who sent all these people to the Bastille. He's a monster. He's an autocrat who doesn't respect the liberty of the people.
And as we'll see next time, that has enormous traction because of the political and financial crisis that France
it does, absolutely. And the tragedy is that in a way, the king has kind of absorbed some of the lessons. So his treatment of Beaumarchais, who has written a preface to one of his plays that the king interprets as being an attack on him. He orders Beaumarchais to be arrested, but this time he doesn't send him to the Bastille. He sends him to a prison called Saint-Lazare, which is a correction centre for delinquent boys, where they're taught the error of their ways and kind of given the birch and things like that. And everyone finds this hilarious. And so Beaumarchais, who's always had laughter on his side, now finds that the laughter is against him. Basically, his reputation is destroyed by it. So it suggests the king is kind of learning how to play the game.
By the way, it's not a despot. I mean, that's one thing. If you think Louis XVI is a despotic monarch, I mean, there are many things that Louis XVI gets wrong, but being too bloodthirsty, too repressive is definitely as any historian wants one.
Right, and if he'd wanted to, if he'd been a real despot, the castle were banished. He wouldn't have been sitting in his chamber having kind of capons. But the other thing that this plays into is the idea of the sexual inadequate, and more specifically now cook-on. Because if Marie Antoinette is cast as being this kind of voracious nymphomaniac, there is the sense that her powers are being drawn from the sexual inadequacies of the king. And so you get all these rhymes about the size and the
rigidity or otherwise,
the flaccidity of the royal member.
Yeah.
And in the kind of the account of the Queen and the affair that de la Motte writes in London, she says that the Cardinal and the Queen had been having an affair, and that they had been engaged in a conspiracy to make the Cardinal Prime Minister of France and to subject France to the dominance of Austria. And so the King is somehow seen as being complicit in this. Yeah. And so the King and Queen of France, the emblems of the greatness of the country, are being cast as agents of their own power.
But Robert Darnton, in his book Revolutionary Temper, quotes a bookseller at the height of the Diamond Necklace affair, who wrote, I think, to a journal to his brother, wrote, "The public spirit is turned against me," said the king. because he inspires no respect, no fear, no confidence, and he throws away the public's money for all sorts of follies. And that, that is the lesson, that if you are a slightly gullible reader of these pamphlets and this sort of these propagandistic kind of pornographic fantasies, that's what you think about the king. That, as Darnton says, he's well-meaning but stupid, bewildered, incompetent, timid, indecisive, constantly drunk, unfit even to govern a German principality.
Yeah, absolutely. And Darnton is brilliant on why this matters, because essentially it's also going with the grain of the crisis that France itself is confronting. That this is a time where the state is running out of money and where people are starting to go hungry. There have been a succession of terrible harvests, and all this kind of stuff about diamond necklaces and cuckolding and cardinals and all kinds of stuff does actually matter, because it gives colour and venom to what otherwise might be kind of the sense of inchoate forces going wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think important just to emphasise at this point, as we approach the fated year 1789, that this is not about republicanism. Again, so much of this is coming from the Duke of Orleans. So it's coming from the Duc de Orleans, the king's young brother. It's also coming from the Duke of Orleans, Duc d'Orléans, who is the kind of after the three royal brothers, the most significant peer in the realm, who has a whole area of Paris as his private fief, the Palais Royal. So he's basically said anyone can publish what they like, and so it's become a hotbed of all these kind of pamphlets and stuff. So there's that. So it absolutely doesn't imply republicanism. It's signs of an immunity system going down, and it matters because basically the whole body politic seems diseased. And Dominic, I think in the next two episodes we're going to explore exactly, beyond the flower gardens of Versailles, exactly how these diseases are kind of manifesting themselves out in Paris and in other sites.
In fact, on Thursday, the crisis that France finds itself in the 1780s, the crisis that leads to the falling of the States General, the revolution. So a little bit of finance, a little bit of politics, lots of famine, all this kind of stuff.
Tennis courts.
There'll be tennis courts, of course. We'll get into the tennis court oath, and then, of course, to the fall of the Bastille. Very, very exciting. À bientôt, à jeudi, et au revoir.
Au revoir.
The French Revolution is the central political event in modern history. There are other things that compete. The Russian Revolution, most obviously.
Or the American Revolution, but I agree, neither of those really compare.
No. To me, the French Revolution is the paradigmatic example of people trying to reboot a society, to make it again, to make something new. So it's that on the one hand. And then, of course, there are other dimensions to it. It becomes the great crucible of conservatism. It's in response to the French Revolution that Edmund Burke writes the most famous example of kind of literary conservatism in history. It's reflections on the Revolution in France. It's the French Revolution that exports the idea of a nation and of modern nationalism across Europe and arguably the world. And its iconography, Tom, we're still so familiar with it. I mean, obviously it gave France its national anthem, it gave it its flag, the particular flag. But the ideas of the idea of left and right comes from the French Revolution, from where people sat. Yeah, exactly. And when you think about all the great writing that's been done on it, even just in English, Dickens' The Tales of the Cities, one of the most influential books on our perception of history that has ever been written. We mentioned
Dickens influenced by Carlyle and his great history of the Revolution.
And of all the history books that have been written in our lifetimes, one of the most influential, the way people write history, I think, is Simon Sharman's book Citizens. Some listeners may not agree with Sharman's take on the revolution. His take is actually not dissimilar from Margaret Thatcher's, because he very much emphasises the violence and cost of the revolution. But the way he did it, the emphasis on narrative, and his ability to to take unexpected aspects and to take bioregs and to make it so rich and fascinating and colourful.
That's his great genius as a writer, isn't it?
Yeah, but that had an enormous impact on other historians.
I mean, it's a reflection of the inherent drama and the scale and sweep of the French Revolution that has inspired such great writers. So it's as well. Her first great story is about the French Revolution.
Actually, it's for me her best book, or one of her certainly best. No, I think it's and what makes it so interesting is not just the high drama, but obviously the questions: why did it all happen, and even more than that.
Well, Dominic, we've answered that. It's because of the diamond necklace.
Right, so we can stop right now.
Yeah, we've solved it.
So to be very, very simple, if people are only going to listen to 6 minutes of this podcast and they want to know why the French Revolution happened, I think there are three ingredients. One is there is a financial and a high political crisis. Effectively, France is running out of money. Number two, a social crisis. So there's horrendous weather, freak weather. There's famine. There is kind of mass hunger in France.
So contingency then.
So contingency.
Playing a very important role.
And then the third thing, which is much more deterministic, is a kind of cultural moment. And I know you'll be talking about this in a subsequent episode. An obsession with progress, with purity, and above all with virtue. And an idea that you can turn the world off and back on again, start again, reboot it, forget about the record of history. And I think it is the combination of those three things that makes it different from the two obvious antecedents, which are Mrs. Thatcher mentioned the Glorious Revolution in Britain in 1688-89, and then of course the revolution in the American colonies.
Although that is important.
It is important, but this is different. It's qualitatively different. Yes. So the question is, why did those three things, how and why did they come together? And for many years, historians looked for big, overarching ideological explanations, but then really, especially from the 1980s onwards, and thanks partly to people like Sharma or Robert Darnton, a brilliant historian, American historian who's written about this period, historians started to use the French Revolution as the subject to reinvigorate the idea of narrative, to say actually events really matter, and the chronology, the series, the chain is enormously important. But you ended last time, you did that brilliant episode about the diamond necklace scandal. Your point that all the discussion about Marie Antoinette and her sort of the semi-pornographic, or very literally pornographic pamphlets, the abuse of her, that reflected an idea that if as it were the body of the queen, the king, the disease, that reflects a disease in the body politic, and that's why we ended. But we didn't say why the body politic was disease. So what is wrong with France? I guess that's the question. And to start with, let's kick off with the man that you introduced us to. So you described him as, I think very reasonably, a kind of reasonably likeable but ultimately slightly inconsequential man. Mild, affable, loves his locks, going hunting, but not a man it is easy to hate. So you look at Louis XVI and you don't see a man who millions of people would want to see dragged.
He's not
to
a
the
monster.
guillotine. No, he's not a monster at all. He became king when he was 19 years old in 1774. And actually that's, you might say, a young man, but actually that's quite old for a French king.
Yeah, because usually they're toddlers, aren't they?
His grandfather, Louis XV, had been 5. His predecessor, Louis XV, had been 4 when he became king. So actually Louis is not badly placed, and he's been prepared for it. His kingdom, as we discussed before, the biggest kingdom in continental Europe, 28 million people, the world's second largest economic power, really, after Britain, the only European country that has both a serious navy and a serious army. Britain, for example, only really has a navy. Paris, very different from today's Paris. So it's the second biggest city in Europe after the navy, but it's a city, it's not the kind of grand city of avenues and boulevards. There's a city of slums, but also, particularly the urban poor and prostitutes and criminals, but also a city of coffee houses and books and ideas and newspapers and theatres and all these kinds of things. And then beyond it, you have the other big cities of France also being very busy. France is unusual in having so many kind of provincial centres, prosperous provincial centres that border and stuff. And then beyond that, 8 out of 10 French people work on the land. In La France profonde, they are peasants, by and large. So France is much, much more agricultural than Britain's.
It is, and also much more kind of state.
Yes.
Places like Britain are very distinct. We saw that when we talked about Carpenter Rover. But he has a sense of his distinctiveness because he is Breton.
Yeah, absolutely. So the funny thing about Louis XVI, Louis XVI would not have been able to establish this subject because they wouldn't have spoken what he would recognise as French. They would have spoken dialects of French, spoken Flemish or Occitan, Breton or German, all of these kinds of things. So Louis has been brought up to be king, and we think of him as an absolute monarch. And he had copied out his teenager text to tell him that French kings had received from God himself the greatest absolute power over other men that has ever been entrusted to them. But that absolute power is very tightly circled.
Shit.
So first of all, he relies on what's left. He relies on judges and nobles and officials. He's got this intendant, they're called the royal officials that they send out to the kingdom. He loses their support. That's very bad for him. He needs them.
He does have a famous exchange, doesn't he? Is it 1787, where he basically someone in the Parliament is saying this is illegal, and Louis famously says it's legal because I say it is. But that's a mark of weakness, isn't it, rather than a strength that he has to say that.
Right, because France does have other institutions and constitutional conventions, and they are so complicated that nobody really understands them. So his grandfather, Louis XV, 1750s, had said, France is such a kind of multi-layered, complicated machine. I'd like to get all this written down on paper so I can make sense of it. And he'd commissioned constitutional scholars to make a compilation of documents. And they came back to him eventually to say, that's not possible. It's much too complicated. Because it's a bit like Britain. It is a massive patchwork of conventions and customs and laws.
But Dominic, you said you compared it to a machine. And we talked about how Louis XVI is a great one for tinkering in a workshop. Do you think that this is a frustration to him? That he, as someone who obviously likes contraptions and working out how things function, that the state kind of defies his ability to do that?
I think absolutely. Because I think Louis, like other people of his generation, is a product of the mid-18th century. It comes from a different world from Louis XIV. He's an Enlightenment man to some degree. And that doesn't mean he's sitting there reading Voltaire, but it means he's in that, he's in that context.
Things can be solved. Things can be solved.
He's also been brought up, by the way, to respect what he sees as the rights of his citizens. I know you're going to be talking a lot about rights in the subsequent episode. And Louis had written down in his kind of exercise book as a board the rights of the citizens, the life, honour, liberty, and property. Not so tax dodgers. So his regime, the ancien régime, as people say, the old regime, in your sort of Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities version of the French Revolution, it's corrupt and cruel, isn't it? There's Marxists kind of
running over paupers in their carriages.
Exactly, all of that stuff. And very antiquated and reactionary. In reality, that regime is very, very modern and is changing all the time. Nobody says we are living in the ancien regime, we're living in the old regime. They think they're living in an age of enormous change and modernity. And you mentioned already Simon Sharman. In his book Citizens, he's brilliant at bringing this out. And he said, wherever you look at the story, there are signs of great excitement and dynamism and energy. So he mentioned French trade, French industry, it's the home of chemistry, maths. Yeah. Both Sharma and Robert Darnton in their books about this emphasise hot air ballooning.
Get out of there!
Great spectacle. And French ballooning is the AI of the day. It's something that people are talking about. They don't know what world it will bring. It's tremendously exciting. The first flight was from the Bois de Boulogne in 1783. And people would say, Robert Darnton quotes in the periodical, we live in the century of inventions. We're surrounded by miracles. Genius is everywhere, conquering nature and the elements.
And that's very enlightening.
It's totally enlightened.
So Benjamin Franklin is a great hero in Paris, and he's a great one for these kind of experiments.
Absolutely, yeah. Because of course the whole American Republic is an experiment, isn't it? So America comes to be identified both with nature and the kind of beauties and simplicity of nature, but also with this idea of progress, of modernity.
To what extent is the existence of the American Republic a kind of standing encouragement to people in France to think, yeah, we could rebuild in that way?
It's a good question. I think people are fascinated by the American experiment. They're curious to see how it works out. People like Benjamin Franklin are very popular in France. But that said, if America didn't exist, the French Revolution would still have happened. Yeah.
Sure.
So I don't think it's a direct inspiration, but I think some of the language, definitely, there's a commonality of language between the French and American Revolution.
And just going on from that, the Crown's support for the American Revolution obviously will play a key part in its ultimate bankruptcy.
Yeah.
But is there also a sense that the fact that a monarch is going to the assistance of rebels against another monarch, an example of someone sitting on a tree, sitting on a branch and soaring off the branch?
Yeah, I think it probably is. I mean, there are people in the French regime who are very nervous about the idea of doing this. So
for that reason?
Well, they're more worried about the finances.
But I just wondered whether there was a kind of, an ideological anxiety about it as well. Because Louis XVI seems not particularly to have been worried about that.
I don't think they're thinking about the American Republic so closely as that, to be honest with you.
Okay.
I think they're more interested in giving Britain a bloody nose. Anyway, so all this excitement about change means you have two things. You have a tremendous sense of possibility on the one hand. We can do anything. We can conquer nature, so what can't we do? And then on the other hand, of course, there are always people who lose out from change. So in this, just to give you a small example, if you're a weaver or an artisan or something, there are new businesses, new industrialized businesses coming up that may put you out of work, and so you would like to blame somebody. And we'll come to that later on. As part of that modernity, I think you also get a new political culture, especially in Paris. This is not created by the French Revolution, it creates the revolution.
Right, because we were talking about that in the context of the kind of pornographic abuse of Marie Antoinette.
Exactly. Robert Darnton's book, The Revolutionary Temper, is absolutely wonderful on all this. On the coffee houses, on people swapping ideas, people would read pamphlets out on street corners. There's a new term, which we're very familiar with, created in 1750 to describe this: opinion publique, public opinion. That phrase was not used before because it didn't really exist in the same way. So there's that, but also I think there is also a really important new language that people use to discuss politics. So we were saying that Louis, you talked about it in the box, the idea of tinkering and the well-being machine and improving it. And that's very much a product of the age of reason. But actually, when he becomes king, and he's 19 years old, there is a generation emerging, this kind of generation below him, who are much more romantic. They are the people who are loving Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Well, but not entirely, because Marie Antoinette, who is his generation, I mean, she's part of that. I mean, she is the great embodiment of that in a way.
It's definitely younger people who embrace that, but of course it percolates out. So Marie Antoinette is absolutely a classic example of somebody who absorbs this cult of sensibility, nature, simplicity, all of these things, intense feeling, tenderness, friendship, family.
And also the idea that if you obey the impulses of your emotions, that will lead you to truth.
Yeah.
So it's kind of bizarre, isn't it? But simultaneously it's an age of reason, but it's also an age of intense feeling. And the assumption seems to be that the two, well, there is a tension there, but there seems to be an assumption that there isn't.
Well, I think there was a slight generation issue. So I think if you were born in 1740, let's say, you grow up in an age that is polite, witty, ironic, sceptical. Voltaire is very sceptical. They love poking fun. There's always a kind of wry smile at the corner of your mouth, that kind of attitude. They're basically quite British. Okay. And I think if you are a generation later, let's say you were born in 1760, then that scepticism and stuff, you find that a bit desiccated maybe. It leaves you cold. What you're all about is your heart, is your living your truth.
Living your truth, yes, absolutely.
tears, crying, is really important to people, and it's important in the revolution. Tears are seen as a sign of authenticity and honesty. So people are always breaking down in tears in the revolutionary story. And the idea that underpins all of this is the idea of virtue. And I was thinking when I was writing the notes, how virtue in the French Revolution is the diversity of its day. In other words, it is an abstract noun that if you have any decency as a person at all, you're in favour of it. And if you start to poke fun at it, or to say, well, I just think it's all overblown, it's the Emperor's new clothes, I don't really agree with it. People say, you're not just old, you're evil.
You say virtue. I mean, you might more properly say virtus, which is the Latin word from which the French word comes, and actually has the sense of manliness as well. And I think one of the dimensions of the French Revolution, which we will be exploring over the course of this series and the subsequent series on it, is the way in which actually the kind of the egalite bros are quite sexist.
Yeah,
of
course.
It is a very, very chauvinist movement, I think, the French Revolution.
I think that's right. So the man who embodies all this more than anybody else, by the way, I think is Maximilien Robespierre, and we'll come to him later on. He absolutely drinks deeply of all this stuff. So it's a very politicised world and very passionate, but it is also, I think it's worth emphasising, even before the revolution, a violent world. In Citizen, Simon Sharma famously wrote that violence was not just a byproduct of politics, but violence was the revolution itself. I think he's right, but I think it's also worth emphasising that France was already quite violent. So any history of 18th century France is punctuated by riots, lynchings, looting, people being publicly beheaded, prisoners being broken on the wheel, troops firing into crowds, all of this. So in other words, when the revolution starts, and it doesn't start with one thing, it starts with a succession of things, a lot of these things have already happened before. They're not novelties. The revolution's not a storm breaking through an otherwise placid blue sky. It's just one storm cloud among many.
Yeah.
We talked about tax and finance. So money is at the absolute centre of it. And we should get into some of the money.
Follow the money.
Follow the money, exactly. We should follow the money. So all early modern monarchies suffered massive money problems. I mean, it's the story of the English Civil War. It's the story of the American Revolution. Monarchies trying to raise more funds. And the reason they're doing that is because they're living in a new age with antiquated systems. There's been a military revolution, so they are funding bigger navies and bigger armies than ever before. But also they're doing it on a global scale, which they weren't doing 200 years earlier. Britain, France, they have to maintain fleets all over the planet.
And for France, the fact that Britain has emerged as a rival power and in a larger economy, I mean, is really it's unsettling, because France has not had to face that before. France has always been the largest power, economically speaking, and so that imposes massive strains, doesn't it? Massive. Talking about the Navy, the Royal Navy is the key British power, and so the French have to have a Navy. But as you say, I mean, it's just unbelievable strain.
It is. So France has been running up massive debts since the 1790s. It doesn't have a national bank. Britain has a national bank, but France, for various reasons, doesn't. So
France had had a kind of traumatic experience with a slightly dodgy Scottish financier,
John Law.
The tulip mania bust.
There'd been a massive stock market bust, and that basically turned them off finance. So they just trust the open national bank.
Yeah, that is when the word millionaire is.
Is that so?
Yeah, because so many people become so rich and then lose it.
Tom, when Theo gives us an absolute roasting,
sorry.
It would definitely not be my fault. So, even before the American War, France has already got very, very big debts. It's got $2 billion in debt, and it's basically spending 60% of its budget servicing its debt, its own interest payments, and this is growing all the time. The interesting thing is that Britain's debt is much greater. Britain its debt is 3 times greater, but Britain has always raised new taxes through the House of Commons. The government needs more money, the House of Commons votes for it, bang, rolled up. France can't do that. It doesn't. Not only does it not have a national bank, it doesn't have a regular elected assembly. People do remember that there was once a thing called the Estates General,
There
It
we
was last
go.
met in 1614, 1615, and nobody can really remember what it was, how it was organised,
Took me long enough.
who voted for it, or anything like that.
Is the existence of the British Parliament that is able to raise money, is this
Okay.
something that
Miller does not
in the
say
build-up
me here,
for a
then.
revolution, people are looking at enviously and saying, why don't we have a system like this?
Yes, a lot of the revolutions at the beginning basically to turn France into Britain. They want a more liberal economy, and they want a representative institution more vote tax increases, and they think, bang, that will magically fix all that problem.
And so that's the States General. That's it's kind of
Run away.
French history.
So France is raising tax through like a lot of very strange antiquated things. They've got a property tax that a lot of towns don't pay. They've got a very lucrative tax on salt, but again, that just increases. That means there's loads of smuggling, and they have internal customs duties. You are a miller in, Provence or something. You want to sell your grain in Paris. You have to pay multiple duties to get your grain from A to B. And that obviously is very bad for the internal economy if people are having to pay tax basically when they step outside their own town to sell things.
And the kind of thing that a workman in his workshop, like Louis XVI, would want to fix.
Would want to fix. Exactly. So here's the thing. Why don't they fix it? Louis, when he comes in at the age of 19, he's tempted by the idea of fixing it. But the issue is that whenever he comes up against opposition, he almost always backs down. So right at the beginning of his reign, he had a bloke with Turgot, who was a liberal reformer, basically started his trust. He wanted to go for growth, deregulate the economy, all of this kind of stuff. He liberalised bread prices. Of course, that meant bread prices went up. There was lots of looting, and Louis eventually basically got rid of it. He said, "You're pushing too far, too fast."
So, Dominic, your case might be probably isn't. Let's not get that.
If he'd been a charismatic and sufficiently adept statesman, that he could take a bit of unpopularity and he could persuade the people he needed, and he could show concrete results, and he'd stuck to his guns, he might have been a much, much more effective king of France. But as it is, what he will do is he will gesture in direction change, and then back down, and he gets into trouble. So, as Sharma says, and I quote, he wanted to be loved. And that is not an ideal thing for a king at a time of tremendous change and challenge. So in the next few years, the problem actually gets a lot worse. And it gets worse, as you say, because they join the American War. So Turgot's eventual successor, a guy called Swiss banker, Necker, Jean-Jacques Necker, great name, he says, go for that American War. Let's help the rebels in the American colonies. And he organises lots of more short-term loans to pay for it. Now, it's mainly a naval war, but as we know, from the rest is history, nothing is more expensive than an 18th century top-notch navy. So they run up huge debts, $1.5 billion, on top of their existing debts, 90% of which comes from loans. This will be a brilliant gamble, by the way, if you get the Caribbean.
Because the Caribbean is so rich.
Yeah, if you get that, that's why they're in the war. They want to get these Jamaica, places like that.
But that requires them to inflict a defeat on Britain more total than the ultimate defeat is.
So although the British lose those 13 North American colonies, they keep lots of the rest of North America. They don't lose any of the Caribbean, which their main priority. So actually the French are basically huge debts and they've got nothing to show for it. Simon Sharma says, without much exaggeration, he said that it was the Boston War that brought on a terminal crisis in the French. So,
should we get to the terminal crisis?
Yes. So let's fast forward 3 years to the year of the diamond necklace trial. So now we're in 1786. The finance minister now
I think phase two
is a guy
is
called
more the
Charles
same,
Alexandre de Calonne. He's very rich, he's very urbane, he's very sort of witty. He's a stock market player, and therefore everybody hates him. For understandable reasons.
Bankers.
And in August 1786, Calonne goes to see Louis XVI, and he says, I've got a bit of a bombshell for you. We are looking into the financial abyss. He says, our annual deficit every year is 18 million livres, and half of all our revenue is now being spent on paying the interest on our existing loans. And he says, what is worse? Necker's short-term loans that he took out to pay for the war in America are about to fall due. And he don't have any money to pay them back. And he says to Louis, we have to totally reform the Constitution. We just have to sort out this problem of the tax system once and for all and get new taxes. Because we can't rely on those to pay the organs. So you may say, well, what is this problem? Why don't they just bring in new taxes? And the reason is, France is a society based on the idea of hierarchy of privileges. So if you are a nobleman or a clergyman, you don't pay tax. And people don't think of that as a disgraceful exemption. They think that's the essence of our liberties. These are our God-given and our ancestral rights as Frenchmen.
And it's a source of aspiration, isn't it, for people? Because it is possible to enter the clergy or to become to gain patents of nobility. So it's a kind of incentive to stick with the system.
It is, and also people don't like the idea of a uniform system like a machine. They say that is what will destroy liberty. Liberty lies in difference and quirks and eccentricities and traditions. And a government that tries to erase that and just to put the stamp of royal authority and say everybody is paid is a despotic government. And we don't want that. We want people to stand up for our traditions. And the people they want in particular are these institutions called the Parlement. Now, confusingly, they're not parliaments.
Right, so these are the ones that the Parlement of Paris, that the Cardinal de Rome wanted to be tried by rather than the king.
They're courts, they're high courts, basically. And around them, so the Parlement of Paris, around them, there's hundreds of people, clerks and stuff. It's got its own kind of quarter of the city. There's a whole kind of community of lawyers and notaries around it. And people invested tremendously. You know, it's culturally very meaningful. People invested with lots of significance. The Parlements, these high courts, when the king introduces an edict, they have to register it. And they have to say, yeah, fine, it doesn't contravene the rights of Frenchmen you as a king have sworn to uphold. And what's happened, there's a pattern that basically, since the 1750s, Louis XV and Louis XVI asked the Parliament to approve to register new taxes. And the Parliament was bitterly resistant. And they have said increasingly, the reason we're resisting new taxes is we're defending liberty against your despotism. We're defending the nation against your court in Versailles. We're defending the ancient French constitution against your suffocating, joyless absolutism.
And does the physical separation of the king in Versailles from the Parlement, say in Paris, that presumably is enhancing that sense of separation between the monarchy and the sense the Parlement have of that they are defending the people's rights?
I think so, Tom. I think absolutely. I think it's a real problem, actually, for Louis XVI. Geography. The fact that Versailles is 12 miles from Paris. He never leaves Versailles, barely ever leaves Versailles. That 12 miles, most ordinary people can't afford to take an expensive coach to Versailles. So he's always slightly sealed off. He's always in a bit of a bubble, and there's a real resentment of that bubble. It creates the idea of a corrupt, out of touch court. And there's, you get the sense that Paris is this kind of place seething with political excitement and theatre and new ideas and newspapers. And Versailles is this sort of airless world of snobbery and religion. And I think it's a really good point. I agree with you. I think it's a huge problem for Louis. So anyway, Calonne says to Louis, look, we've got this huge problem. The Parlement will never give us what we want. We have to bypass them. We have to go over their heads. I'm going to call an assembly of the greatest men in the kingdom, the notables. If they agree with the idea of taxes, then maybe we can basically control the Parlement.
And this idea of an assembly of notables, this is, again, something of a Danish precedent that, they came out of the box and create conditions.
Exactly. Yeah, it is, exactly. And Louis says to Calonne, I'm not sure about this. And this is a very big step to try to bypass the institutions to get this money. And Calonne says, trust me, if you do this, you will go down in history as the man with courage and foresight who solved the financial problems of the French monarchy forever. And historian Jeremy Hockney has a very strong line in his book. He says, and so Louis XVI allowed Calonne to set in motion a series of events that would lead to the overthrow of his monarchy.
This assembly of the notables has gathered with what consequence?
So basically, Calonne has brought together all the bigwigs in the kingdom: princes, archbishops, judges, dukes, all of these people. And he says to them, right, okay, here's my plan. We're going to abolish all these mad tax privileges. We're just going to have one tax on landed property, and irrespective of your social status, you'll have to pay.
So he's asking.
Okay, it's a jump attack opportunity.
He is, but he's saying that this is in the interest of France. Come on, we've got to do this. We don't want to be losing to the British.
Sure.
Number two, he says, we're going to lift some of these mad tax regulations. Let's have the same, you pay the same duty wherever you are in France. Let's have freer markets so people can sell across France. Let's, all of these vested interests, we can relax some of these rules. So we'll have more competition, we'll have more growth. And number three, he says, I know I'm asking you a lot, so we're going to have elected local assemblies, regular elected local assemblies, and basically you, the landowners, the bigwigs, will dominate them. So, you'll get your way. Your privileges will remain intact. It's a very, very enlightened scheme. It's a very mid-18th century scheme. It's rational, it's sensible, it's kind of, let's have a bit of uniformity and sort this thing out.
So it's not going to work.
Yeah, and the notables just hate it. They hate it because they don't like obviously paying the land tax. They don't like his plan for the assemblies because he says, well, obviously you'd sit with the commons in your province together in one assembly. They don't like that at all. They say the commons, which they call the third estate, they have to be separate. We're not sitting with those great unwashed, riff-raff. And they say it's always the game these different institutions play. To basically kick the tax increases down the road, they say, you'd have to call the Estates General. I mean, no one really knows what that is, but they sort of, because they think it'll never happen, I suspect. They say, call the Estates General to approve
it's like
the taxes.
the Aztecs bringing out the owl.
Right.
It's the ultimate recourse.
You need more representation. Basically, we don't want to carry the can for the tax increases. You have to get a bigger body to do it. Calonne is really furious about this, and now he does something that is actually disastrous from the perspective of the French monarchy. He goes public. He seeks to rouse the people. He sends a pamphlet out to every priest in the city in Paris, and he says, you have to read this to your congregation for Sunday sermon. He has it reprinted in gazettes, he has it read out in street corners, and read aloud to the crowds in Les Halles, in the big markets. And this thing, he tells people, France is at a crossroads. Finances are in a total mess. Either we have total change or total collapse. And in this pamphlet, he uses a lot of the language that anticipates the revolution. So he's using terms like the national will, patriotism. He says, the privilege will be sacrificed. Yes, when justice requires it and demands it, would it be better to tax again the unprivileged, the people? And that kind of language, people haven't heard that from French royal finance ministers before. He's anticipating other terms that will be used in the revolution. Now, when he comes out with all this, the notables get absolutely pessimistic. How dare you rouse the people against us?
So they complain to Louis about it.
So they complain to Louis. Louis, as is always the way, Louis Saxon. Sorry, mate. Keep going. The notables don't like it. As Sharma says in Citizens, by taking his case to the public, Calonne made politics a matter of national attention. Once Pandora's box had been opened in this way, it proved impossible to close the lid. After Calonne, anything was possible.
We love Pandora's box.
I like the fact that Sharma's gone for Pandora's box.
Pandora's box has been opened. Still has revolution.
Definitely they are. Now, the trouble is that debate has started. A public debate. People are talking about this in cafes and street corners and things. And as amazing as it may sound to me, most people take the note to the side of the very privileged people who don't pay more taxes. So Robert Darnton quotes journalists of the day, "Our notables, which are thought to be puppets or courtiers, are for the most part well-informed patriots who know the true interests of the nation. Because the one thing that people are really worried about is not the fact that nobles don't pay taxes. It is they have a dread of an overweening autocratic monarchy. So the nobles are very good at posing as the defenders of the French people's liberties. And people believe it. You know, people are roused by it.
But they're kind of riding a crocodile.
They are, oh, totally, yeah. The notables are in for a shock. So now Louis has to find a new finance minister, and he says, well, what I'll do is get one of the notables to do it. I mean, that's quite a canny idea. He gets a guy who's the Archbishop of Toulouse, who'd been very outspoken, who's called Etienne Charles de Lomini de Brienne.
He's one of those kind of classic late 15th century French bishops who go, oh God.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the thing. There was talk of making him Archbishop of Paris, and Louis apparently said, surely, yeah, as Archbishop, you should believe in God. But he was mad at it. And Brienne also, entertainingly, there's a lot of skin disease in this.
There really is.
So Brienne, I read, he suffered from a skin disease that left his face, quote, a mass of peeling scabs and tissue, and yet he was thought of as a personable and congenial man. So that says a lot for his personality.
It does. Well, so we've had Louis XV, who died with his face covered in pustules, and we're going to be meeting Marat, aren't we? Who,
Mirabeau, the ugliest man in France.
Mirabeau, yes, his face. Well, yes. So lots of big figures with unpleasant skin complaints.
Yeah. So Brienne had been an opposition figure, and he had said, like a lot of the notables, I think Calon's stuff about the deficit is balderdash. I don't think there really is a deficit, actually.
Let's look at the books and just
that's where I look at the books. Oh my God! There'll be loads of money. And he looks at the books. He says, well, Calon, it's true. Calon wasn't telling the truth about the deficit, because he wasn't. It's not 80 million. It's 140 million.
Oh, no.
And so actually Brienne then has to go back with his skin complaint to his old chums in the notables.
Really?
He says, actually...
You know, guys.
Actually, we do need new taxes, and he wants a land tax and a stamp tax. What could possibly go wrong with the stamp tax, Tom? Always very successful. And the notables say yet again, no, we don't like so. You know, you will have to call the Estates General one of these taxes, whatever it is, you know, to call it. So they scrap the Assembly of the Notables. So we're in 1787. And Louis is very, very impressed by this. So there are accounts of him saying, you know, he's basically spent all this time now going hunting and drinking and eating because he realises, I mean, it's amazing.
What?
Can get, he's by this point got incredibly obese. So you pick a horse that has to carry him. He's getting very fat.
He is very fat, but it's a sad fat, Tom, not a jolly fat.
Oh, definitely. He's not a jolly man.
No.
He's a sad fat man.
He's a sad fat man because he's... I think he can see that this is going to be really difficult.
Well, because what options does he have? Well, I mean, terrible. Every option is bad.
So Brienne and Louis get together and what are we going to do? They have two options. One is they could just do what everyone says and call this Estates General. But the issue with that is, once you open that box, one of Simon Sharma's boxes, where's it going to lead? Like, will they have to have a constitution? Will they demand more power? Will you basically be reduced to being a British constitutional monarch? And Louis doesn't really want that for obvious reasons. I mean, why would you? You'd want to keep as much power as possible. The other thing they could do is they could go back to the old traditional thing of going through these courts, these parliaments, and somehow persuade or bully them into approving the taxes. And Brienne says, "You can't do that." So he goes to the Paris Parliament, summer of 1787. How about a stamp and tax? How about a land tax, lads? And the Parliament of Paris say, no way. And they reject them in very groundbreaking language. They say, the days when kings just ask for taxes are gone. That absolutism is over and the king must be governed by the law. The nation must give its consent to the taxes with regular meetings of the Estates General. And for the first time, they use a word to describe their fellow Frenchmen that had not been used before by such institutions. They don't call them subjects of the king, they call them citoyens, citizens.
But the thing that's amazing about this is that it's in defence of nobles and clergy not paying tax.
Yeah, it is.
All this kind of language that will be used in the revolution that consumes both the church and the nobility is first being used to defend the privileges of the church and the nobility.
It is. It's bonkers, isn't it? And I think there's two things there. One is that there's a degree of self-interest, obviously. But there are also the idea that all the nobility are like this sort of Dickensian vicomtes who are like whipping their peasants and forcing themselves on sort of poor women and stuff. A lot of these people are actually quite liberal. They have absorbed the language of the Americans, the American colonists, and they genuinely believe in the Estates General and represents. They actually do like the idea of a British constitution.
And we talked about one of them. Previous episode, who's Calais in central Paris, is the great centre of free speech of the pamphlets, and will be the same in Jacobin.
Yeah, exactly. So there are people who genuinely, it's partly self-interest, but there are people, let's not pretend that there aren't people who genuinely believe this and really do think that this is a great way, that making a huge fuss about these taxes is a great way to get what they want in the long run, which is basically the British system, the system that's been advocated by the great writer Montesquieu. Let's have that in France, separation of powers, proper legislature, all of that, prime ministers, all of that kind of stuff. Anyway, Brienne is outraged that the Parliament has rejected his plan. And he now does a couple of very, very drastic things. First of all, the Parliament's exiled Croix in August, and literally was sealed off by the Swiss Guard, by the French army, and they're all basically kicked out. And the reaction to that in Paris was totally deadly. So if you had a time machine and went to Paris in 1787, you got out, you would think that your coordinates got the wrong. You got the setting wrong. Because you'd think, whoa, this is the French Revolution. Because there is rioting by the clerks, people who are giving out royal edicts were attacked by the crowd and two of them were beaten to death. A suspected police agent is beaten to death by the crowd, and the government eventually has to send in infantry units to secure the streets of the capital, and they end up shutting down loads of clubs and societies. They even shut down chess clubs because they don't want subversive ideas to spread. And there's the real sense from 1787, from this point, that the capital is, dare I say, a tinderbox, Tom?
Or is it more than a tinderbox? Has it already slipped royal control?
I think to some degree it has slipped royal control, actually. And I think from 1787 all the way through to 1789, it's a question of trying to regain royal control. And there are troops on the streets, pretty much all the time from this period.
Because there was the Queen being forbidden by the King to go into Paris.
Right, exactly. So that's against this backdrop, isn't it? The hostility to Marie Antoinette. Absolutely. So the months pass very uneasily, and then in April 1788, Brienne just unveils a new plan to try and break the deadlock. And it's quite clever in a way. What he does is he will strip these courts, the Parliament, of their ability to police royal edicts. He will beef up the powers of the courts below the lower courts. They'll take over the Parliament's power, and there'll be a new court set up, the plenary court, which will approve royal taxes, and obviously he will stuff that court with people. And the Parliament will just be reduced to basically arbitrating disputes on nobility, which is a pretty pitiful kind of thing for them to be doing. And again, there are massive riots in Paris. There's great outpouring of rage. But the interesting thing here is so much of the French Revolution story is told about Paris, and you just assume the rest of the country is being dragged along Paris's way. But that's not the case, because the worst riots about Brienne's parliamentary plan are in places like Lyon and Aix and Dijon. So provincial capitals, where having a high court is very important to them.
It's not surprising, is it? Because we talked about how France is a much more geographically close country than, say, Britain. It's a bit like Scotland defending its independence against London.
Exactly, yeah.
What makes you distinctive is incredibly important.
Yes. imagine the government trying to scrap the courts in Scotland and saying, let's have just one British court. I mean, imagine that, how all the controversy.
All right,
Yeah,
Exactly. Now, this brings us to the city where the French Revolution begins.
And it's an unexpected place.
It is. So I don't think the French Revolution begins in 1789. I think it begins in 1788. And I think it begins in Grenoble.
So justify that, Dominic.
So, Grenoble, city in the foothills of the Alps, southeastern France. It calls itself the cradle of the revolution. That's how it brands itself to this day. It's a very ordinary place, which you might think makes it a weird place for the revolution to have begun. But no, the ordinariness that is precisely why the revolution begins in Grenoble. Grenoble is basically the capital of the province of Dauphiné. It's a long way from Paris. Its regional distinctiveness matters to it. And there's a parliament in Dauphiné, and there are loads of people associated with it. Lawyers, people, journalists, useless writers, all of this kind of thing.
Kind of people you get on Twitter.
Exactly that. People who spend all day sitting behind their computers firing off angry messages.
Yeah.
They owe their livelihoods to that court. If it is downgraded or removed, they will lose that. Also, Grenoble is a glove making centre, and they're very good at making gloves. They export them all over the world, to America, to Russia. But the glove making business is in real trouble because all of these woes have led to an economic downturn, and lots of people have been put out of work, so there's a lot of anger. So, on Saturday the 7th of June 1788, the day the French Revolution begins, Brienne has his edict read out in the marketplace, and he has his market day, and he has troops that basically take the Parliament leaders out of Grenoble, which is what he's trying to do across the country, to take them out of their centres. And the law clerks come out and they start haranguing people and shouting people in the marketplace. This is what's happening, isn't this terrible? And it basically escalates from a protest to a general strike and then a huge riot. They close the city gates, they lay siege to the governor's house. The authorities send in soldiers, but not enough. People go up to the roofs of their houses and they get these tiles and they start bombarding the soldiers with tiles. So it goes down in history as the Day of the Tiles. The soldiers, as is so predictable, they lose their cool, they start shooting, they kill a 12-year-old boy and they kill a hatter. And then the crowd go ballistic, they're parading the blooded clothes of these people around, they start ringing the bells to summon peasants in from the countryside. Because of course, because it's market day, a lot of people have come in from the countryside already. So they're sailing to the peasants. Your relatives are under attack from the soldiers. Come and defend them quickly. So people are pouring into the city. Basically, the crowd seizes, the mob seizes the city. They sack the governor's house. Tom, you'll be gutted about this. They ransacked the governor's natural history cabinet.
I saw that. Yes. And they took stuff legal. Yeah, I suppose you can't.
Well, of course, it's famous, as it's been remarked on this podcast, they do not actually make the omelette.
So basically there is an intra-elite attempt to kind of grab the leaders of power. But essentially that fight between the kind of rival sections of the elite has been overtaken by a mass upheaval.
Yeah, it has. And actually, Simon Sharma is absolutely brilliant on this. It's one of the many, many fantastic insights in his book. And we shouldn't make this the Sharma fancast. But he points out the judges are carried aloft by the crowd, apart from the judges. But he says it's not clear at this point. Are they the leaders? They're not the leaders of the riot. They're more it's kind of its trophies, a bit like the stuff being, but they're also kind of its prisoners.
Right, and this is something that happens again and again. Looking ahead, it's an experience of the royal family.
Exactly. And some of the older judges are very anxious about this and they don't actually live in the city. They don't want to be associated with it. But there's a younger generation who are infused and actually see in the disorder and the collapse of all authority a chance to lead, to profit. And the classic example of this is a guy who I think you can argue is the first true French revolutionary leader. So he's a young judge from Grenoble, and he's called Jean-Joseph Mounier. And he is just such a perfect example of a French revolutionary leader. He's the son of a cloth merchant. He's upwardly mobile. He's 29, so he's young, as so many of them were.
And he's
a lawyer.
Yeah.
They're all lawyers.
They're all lawyers, aren't they? They're all young lawyers.
And he's really ambitious. They're basically like Athelstan members, Tom. They're young lawyers of the Rest is History Club. French revolutionaries in waiting. So he has bought the office of a royal judge. And he has actually become a he's on the lowest possible rank of nobility.
And isn't that always the way, classically, in a revolution, that it's the people, it's not the poor, it's always the uply mobile who haven't got quite uply mobile enough.
Exactly. And he sees this as a chance to jump up the ladder and to turn the ladder into his ladder. So he convenes a huge meeting on the 21st of July 1788 outside the Chateau de Wiesel. The Chateau de Wiesel, if you're there today, is the world's only museum of the French Revolution. And there's a reason for that. Because you can argue again, this is one of the absolute places where the French Revolution began.
Well,
a year before
if you were a Grenoble tourist.
If you're the Grenoble Tourist Board, exactly. And at this meeting, he says, listen, we want free elections. We want the Estates General of Dauphiné, each province to have its own Estates General. And when that's going to meet, and when that meets, the third estate, the Commons, should have the same numbers as the other two estates, the Lords and the clergy put together, and they should all sit in one chamber, not multiple chambers like they have in Britain, Lords and Commons, all one chamber, so that the Commons can dominate. In other words, majority rule, the general will dominate over the privileges of the old order. And a lot of historians say that's so groundbreaking and seismic that is the true kick-off point for the revolution, the chain of events that will lead to the revolution. And there's two other things that I think are really revealed about that meeting in Wiesel. First of all is the language is so sophisticated. It's all about patriotic fire, sacrifices. The law should be the expression of the general will. But the other thing is there is a darker side to it. So this is the first time these people say our opponents we are patriots, but our opponents are traitors to the patrie, and they should be treated accordingly.
Because there's a kind of incipiently totalitarian quality to saying that you are the embodiment of the nation.
Definitely there is, Tom.
Because if you are the embodiment of the nation, your enemies therefore aren't, and by definition are traitors.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I totally agree. Now, of course, you can say there's a great irony here, that actually even Mounier and his friends have not really understood what happened in Grenoble, that riotous day. They think, because they've been chaired aloft by the crowd, they think they're going to control it. And they are, of course, dead wrong. Some of these people are going to end up dead, and literally dead. But I think what makes it so revealing is that it is indicative of this change in the language and the sentiment that is happening in 1788. Previously, all that stuff, the old liberties of the French, that the government, a modernising government, is trying to squash. But in 1788, you can see that language changing, and people are now saying, let's actually do something new. Who cares about the past? We can use this opportunity to draw up a new constitution. Sharma gives a brilliant example of a lawyer called Volney, who wrote German in the century. What does it matter to us what our fathers have done or how and why they have done it? The essential rights of man, his natural relations to his fellows in the state of society, these are the basis of any form of government. So in other words, that they're going to take that, the idea of starting again, and they take the passion, the idea of virtue, all of that, and that gives them, you could argue, what Robert Darnton called a radically simplified view of politics.
And also, it's very contrary to the way that the Constitution has evolved in Britain, where the whole point of the relationship between House of Lords and House of Commons has evolved over time and is rooted in the past.
Yeah.
So therefore, for instance, it's starting to fade as a model for the more radical opponents of the new constitution.
But also what is so interesting is that it's also different from the American constitution makers. happens. Because they're basically, the American Constitution is a slightly trapped the British mindset. So there, it's about the separation of powers. They want to ensure against a kind of mob democracy. They want to ensure against somebody having too much power. It's kind of, their constitution is hedged about with kind of nuances and qualifications. The French revolutions have no time for that. Sharma quotes a guy who's a friend of Rousseau's called Comte d'André, who said, the people is the state itself. By the immutable laws of nature, the people is everything. Everything should be subordinated to the people. That is not how British Whig politicians spoke. It's not really how American colonists spoke. This sense of, it's very simple. There's us, the side of virtue and patriotism and liberty, and then there's them, despotism, depredations and corruption, all that sort of thing, traitors. So right there, even before the fall of the Bastille, the line's been drawn very starkly. Now meanwhile, Mr. Brienne, as Pustules, the Archbishop, is sitting there on the side. What on earth? And clearly everything is all kicked off his plan as it worked. And he says to Louis, listen, you have to call we do have to call the Estates General. We're going to have to do this. And Louis says to him, what, Archbishop? You must think we are lost. They might overturn the state and the monarchy. And Brienne says, I'm afraid we have no choice at all. So in the second week of August 1788, they go public and they say, we're going to call the Estates General. We'll figure out how it will work in due course. We don't really know what the rules will be, how it will be elected, but we will call it all the same.
What could possibly go wrong?
And then, against this background, a massive development. On the 16th of August, Brienne announces they have run out of money. They have been surviving all this time on loans, but the royal treasury is virtually empty. From now on, people will be paid in IOUs, in paper money, which they don't really believe exists. In other words, France is bankrupt.
What a cliffhanger. So, in the next episode, the Estates General will be meeting. The revolution will be beginning. If you accept it's already begun in Grenoble, it will be continuing. And if you just can't wait to find out what happens, you can do it right now by joining the Resistance History Club at theresistancehistory.com. Alternatively, the next episode very soon. We'll see you then. Bye bye. Bye bye.
It's a terrible storm, and of course, if you've been listening to the series, which you know you have, you will know that it strikes when France is gripped by this political and financial crisis. And the storm is then followed by a drought across France, then suddenly very hot summer. And farmers are writing to the court of Versailles, sending letters asking for help. Our once ravishing countryside has been reduced to an arid desert. And there's a real sense of kind of catastrophe. That was Scottish. There's a real sense of incipient catastrophe, which of course, in the context of what we were talking about in the last episode,
It's not helpful, is it?
it's not helpful at all. The interesting thing, actually, is that last time we were talking about the Ancien Régime and the sort of how the stereotype is so misleading. And so it is with this case. You would think, if you had read A Tale of Two Cities, sort of, you're used to the caricatures of the French Revolution and the French elite, that nobody did anything to help them. And you would be wrong. Because actually, the Archbishop of Paris launches this big charity drive, the king gives a livre, even though the monarchy's pretty much run out of money. There's a national lottery is organised, and it raises 12 million livres to pay for relief. But, as we will see, it is not remotely enough to rescue the situation because, Tom, nature has more storms in store.
Wow. So the elements are combining against the monarchy.
They are indeed.
And the Ancien Régime
is in a mess, I think it's fair to say. Were you trying to think of a meteorological metaphor for the...
No, I've moved on from the meteorological metaphors. I was maybe thinking of a building one. I was thinking perhaps it's tottering on its foundations.
It is tottering on its foundations. Because as we discussed at the end of the last episode, something looking very much like a French Revolution has already broken out in Grenoble, and in Dauphiné in the southeast of France, and has spread to other provinces. Louis XVI, in desperation, has announced that he will call the Estates General. And we ended last time with the bombshell that Archbishop Brienne, the finance minister, has basically declared bankruptcy, at least partial bankruptcy.
And it's ironic, isn't it? He doesn't believe in gold and all these acts of gold.
Get out of there.
Well, he didn't believe in the deficit, then he was pointed to the books.
He's all right.
Yes. Well, his learning curve is abruptly terminated a week later, on the 25th of August, when he is booted out, and the monarchy turns to the one person who everybody in France thinks can rescue the situation. This is a man we mentioned very briefly last time. His name is Jean-Jacques Necker, and he is not a courtier. He is not an aristocrat. He is not even French. He is a Swiss Protestant from a Genevan banking
No
family.
way.
He is meant to be the great financial wizards of Western Europe.
Because the Swiss, even then, have a kind of reputation for sobriety and the kind of man that you would trust to sort out your bank balance.
Totally, they do. Yes, exactly. Necker is it seems odd now from our perspective, all these centuries later, to comprehend how a Swiss banker could be such a folk hero across France.
Yeah, I know.
But absolutely, there was a sense in France in the late 18th century that Protestants, although they are weird, alien and heretical, are nevertheless, they're very boring and they can be trusted. And Swiss Protestants...
Yeah, they're kind of black sober suits. And
Exactly.
all that kind of thing.
So when I was reading up on Necker, I was reminded of how a lot of people in Britain thought about the Canadian national banker, Mark Carney, who...
Listen to the rest of
A listener to the rest is history, exactly. Who ran the Bank of England. And there was a perception, I think, in Britain that he was very measured, very Canadian, very kind of controlled, kind of apparently very sober. And I'm not saying he wasn't sober. I'm just saying that's how, the avoidance of doubt, that's how he appeared. And I'm
He's listening. Dominic, he's not accusing you.
no, I'm not. But I'm saying people attributed him, people who knew nothing about Mark Carney, precisely because he was an outsider, not tainted by local politics, people attributed him with sort of extraordinary powers. They saw him as a figure who represented stability, solidity, and he wasn't...
And also neutrality.
yeah, neutrality.
And
exactly.
objectivity, not having too many vested interests. And I guess that's why people think Necker is a deus ex machina.
They do.
Someone who could be introduced to kind of cut through the Gordian knots that have been
Yeah.
strangling the French economy.
We love it. I mean, not just one Gordian knot, according to you, but multiple Gordian knots.
All of them.
So yeah, Necker.
Sprouting like Hydra's heads.
And Necker, to be fair, is brilliant at... I mean, the one thing he'd done is he'd got loans for the American War. You might argue with disastrous consequences. He's very good at getting loans because he has so many friends in the banking business. So as soon as he arrives, he says, I can do what Brienne could not. I can get my friends to lend me money at decent rates. I will be able to tide us over at least another year until the Estates General can meet and we can actually sort this thing out and even perhaps set up some new constitutional body or whatever it might be that will approve taxes. And so the stock exchange, which was very jittery in the summer of 1788, kind of returns to normal. And there's a sense, maybe we've got a bit of direction, maybe we've got a bit of calm. But I think that sense, Tom, would be illusory.
Well, surely people know that there's an absolute catastrophe looming because the hailstones wipe out
They do indeed.
the wheat harvest.
They do indeed.
And that, of course, has terrible implications for bread.
There were days of celebrations in Paris that turned into rioting. There was fighting between the Paris Watch and these celebrators/rioters. Perhaps 20 people were killed in the fighting. I mean, this is fighting with kind of... This is your classic kind of... The Watch have sabres and bayonets. By the end, they're firing into the crowds. Soldiers restore order in the capital, eventually. But exactly as you say, because of the storms, everybody knows that something very bad is going to happen. And the reason is this thing about bread. It's the classic thing in the French Revolution is that you get great hordes of people chanting for bread. It's one of the kind of images. And the reason for this is that 3 out of 4 people in France subsist almost entirely on basically a particular kind of loaf, which is called a £4 loaf. If you've got a family of 4, You need 2 of these loaves every day to feed them. Now, 1 loaf costs 8 sous, and a manual labourer makes about 25 sous a day. So in other words, he will be spending half, maybe more than half of his daily income on these 2 loaves of bread. And if the bread prices rise, he's in a real mess. So by October, the price has already gone from 8 to 12 sous, and eventually, as we'll see, it will peak at about 15 sous around about the time.
And it peaks, doesn't it, on 14th of July, 1759?
The day before the Bastille. Now you could say, we could say, I mean, there's nothing anyone can do about this. This is a complete act of God. You know, the storms have destroyed the harvest. There is not enough. There are not enough crops, not enough wheat. There's not going to be enough flour. There's not going to be enough bread. Prices will rise.
But this is an age of pamphlets and rumours and conspiracy.
Exactly.
Right?
The Parisians.
And so if something bad happens, someone must be to blame.
Exactly. That's exactly it. They have been, ever since the whole issue was opened by Calonne, and obviously in many ways going back even further, there has been this rhetoric of the king's ministers who are despotic and they don't care and they just want to trample on our ancient liberties and all of that stuff. And now people start to say, well, this is all the fault of the king's ministers. They're not giving us any relief. They're probably hoarding grain themselves, to be honest. They're probably profiting from all this and driving the prices up. Only the Estates General can save us. And then if that's not bad enough, I promised you that nature had more tricks up her sleeve. On the 26th of November 1788, there is an unexpected snowfall. Basically, winter has come unexpectedly heavily and unexpectedly early. And this kicks off what Robert Dancer describes as the longest, coolest, and coldest winter in France ever. So by December, Paris is completely covered with snow. The Seine is frozen over. People are walking on the Seine. There are frozen bodies lying in the streets. By New Year's Eve, the temperature has fallen to the lowest ever recorded in France, -10 degrees Fahrenheit. The rivers are all frozen. Of course, the rivers being frozen means that the water.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they can't grind.
They can't create flour.
Yeah.
The rivers are frozen. The roads are snowbound. They cannot transport supplies of bread to those areas that are suffering the most. And the snow is everywhere. It's as far south as the Languedoc in the southwest. And it falls pretty much every day, every other day, between February and 1789. I mean, this is a real freak winter.
And so they must all be standing
Completely they are, yeah, because they're getting reports all the time. Basically, there's a lot of people in France who are labourers with no land, and they rely on seasonal work